In approximately the 10th century AD, the famous medieval Arab traveler and scholar Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi set out on an exciting exploratory journey from his hometown, Baghdad. In his youth, he devoted many hours to studying various disciplines, jurisprudence, medicine, and philosophy. He drew inspiration from the works of great classical thinkers, such as Aristotle and other ancient scholars, whose ideas formed the foundation of his knowledge and worldview. At the turn of the 10th century, he undertook a series of bold travels that led him to many significant and well-known cities in the region. Among them were major centers such as Mosul, Jerusalem, Damascus, and Aleppo. All these cities were renowned for their rich history and cultural heritage. About a millennium later, his path through the harsh and challenging Sinai Desert brought him to the banks of the Great Nile River, which at that time was a fateful route for merchants and travelers. During his travels, al-Baghdadi created an expedition diary in which he recorded not only his impressions but also philosophical reflections on his observations and experiences, entitled The Book of Admonitions and Instructions. In this book, he enthusiastically describes his perception of Egypt, a country surrounded by the oldest monuments and shrouded in mysterious legends. Egypt is presented as a vast valley, flanked on both sides by two chains of hills that protect it from the east and the west. In the center of this valley gently flows the majestic Nile River, like a giant lifeline connecting the lands. It moves between the hills and then reaches Lower Egypt, where it divides into branches that flow into the sea's expanse. The uniqueness of the Nile lies in its length. Among the watercourses known to us worldwide, there is no river that covers such a vast distance from source to mouth that it can truly be called long and continuous. Traveling through Egypt, al-Baghdadi was amazed by the countless ancient monuments, sites he had never seen before. Majestic stone temples, tomb ruins, and burials scattered along the banks of the Nile seemed to him like fantastic images filled with mysteries and unfathomable history. However, the most powerful impression was made by the famous monuments, the pyramids at Giza. These gigantic stone structures, built near the city of Memphis, represented the pinnacle of engineering thought and craftsmanship of the ancient Egyptians. The first thing that caught the eye was the numerous pyramids arranged in a layout resembling a line extending towards Memphis, spreading over a distance of no less than 2 days' journey. Some of them were impressive in size, like ancient monuments that had stood the test of centuries, while others were smaller but no less astonishing. The primary material used in construction was stone, with many pyramids made from large blocks carved from natural rock formations. Some structures were built from clay bricks, used for simpler constructions, but most buildings were sturdy stone constructions, stepped pyramids and smooth ones with flowing contours, creating an impression of absolute harmony. Among all the buildings in Giza, 3 pyramids stand out particularly due to their grandeur and scale. These famous monuments are aligned in a single row and, despite the centuries, continue to evoke unwavering admiration from visitors and scholars alike. In particular, 2 of them, the largest, impress with their grandeur, like monuments of time capturing the strength and genius of ancient masters. Their shape and size are so striking that the gaze fixed upon them seems to distort under the weight of perceiving such beauty, and the sensation of the surrounding atmosphere is impossible to convey in words. At the heart of this grandeur, al-Baghdadi did not forget to note the lives of the local inhabitants living near these magnificent structures. He described in detail the people who, climbing the walls of the pyramids, shed for stones for repairs, or for extracting rare materials. Among them were those who were obsessively studying the labyrinths of tunnels and chambers scattered beneath layers of earth, and some, risking their lives, ventured inside the pyramids to explore their secrets. The discovery and study of these ancient chambers inspired them to new discoveries, and one of the well-known pyramids had a special entrance hole through which people could enter to understand and grasp the mysterious secrets hidden inside these unique structures. This mysterious hole leads to narrow, winding corridors, tight passages, mysterious wells, traps, and other enigmatic spaces, as told by the brave adventurers, those who dared to penetrate the deepest and most hidden corners of the ancient pyramid. Many enthusiasts and researchers, inspired by the enigmatic structure and its many hidden mysteries, strive to go inside and uncover its secrets, hoping to touch the great ancient wisdom. However, often, halfway through, they are forced to stop without reaching their goal. In their stories, they mention that inside the pyramid lived bats, no smaller than pigeons, that hung their nests in dark corners. On the exhausted stone walls of the structure, ancient inscriptions still remain, made with mysterious symbols and hieroglyphs whose meanings have yet to be fully revealed by anyone. no person encountered in Egypt could confidently say that they know how to decipher these symbols. According to ancient legends, a mysterious figure, whose name was not known at the time, allegedly once visited the Sphinx. It was then almost completely buried under layers of sand and dunes. Moreover, somewhere deep in the desert expanses, more than 100 miles from the three famous pyramids, he noticed strange figures and silhouettes, sometimes resembling human shapes, sometimes objects that seemed frozen in space. Like an arrow shot from a drawn bow, a huge head with a long neck arose from the ground, which modern researchers call mysterious figures, the old father of horror. Locals say that its body lies underground, hidden from view. The face of this fantastic creature was distinguished by astonishing beauty and the finest elegance, as if an invisible mysterious smile played in its features, evoking both awe and admiration. The most surprising of all is the personality of al-Baghdadi, who was struck by the skill of ancient engineers who created these grand structures and managed to preserve them for such long centuries. The construction of the pyramids was dictated not only by engineering thought but also by strategic, economic and political considerations, for every aspect of their creation was carefully selected and designed taking into account the resources and power of the time. The method by which these wonders were erected astonishes not only from the point of view of aesthetics and design but also in terms of execution accuracy, which allowed them to withstand the tests of time, overcoming centuries and epochs. It seemed that the very nature of time itself should have bent under the power of these monuments, yielding to new eras. But despite everything, the noble minds of those times poured all their strength, knowledge, and moral aspiration into the construction of the pyramids. Honestly and sincerely dedicating their efforts to these structures, they created something that remains a model of genius and craftsmanship. Majestic, towering above the environment, these monuments became living witnesses of those distant ancestors, telling about the people, the creators, and their amazing achievements. Erected at the early stages of human civilization development, these monuments reflect the depth of human thought and life, leaving a vivid, timeless mark in the history of mankind. When al-Baghdadi visited Giza about 12 centuries ago, the Great Pyramid was the tallest man-made structure on the planet and has lasted for more than 3,700 years. During all this time, it has become a symbol of the greatness and power of an ancient civilization that originated on the banks of the Nile River and experienced many rises and falls before disappearing forever from history. The civilization of the Nile Valley is a unique cultural phenomenon that enthralls us with an exciting journey through the pages of human history. And I want to share with you how entire societies arose in these rich, fertile lands, societies that created some of the most enduring and recognizable structures in the world. I will tell you about how these great civilizations emerged, how they endured the test of time, and how they ultimately vanished from the historical horizon, leaving behind only legends and ruins. The history of Egypt is one of the greatest and most layered epics in the biography of the human race. Many empires pride themselves on the achievements of their rulers, considering themselves fortunate if they managed to pass thoroughly through the 31st dynasty. In contrast, ancient Egypt recorded not just 11 but 31 dynasties spanning more than 3,000 years, a truly incredible duration for human history and a foundation for the development of a civilization that left a significant mark on the time and culture of the entire world. For over 5,000 years, linguists and historians have been attempting to unravel the complex network of interdependencies between rulers, epochs, and destinies of one of the oldest states in the world, Egypt. Each epoch, each reign in this mysterious civilization is carefully divided into specific periods, the most well-known of which are the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. These major stages of history do not exist in isolation. Numerous transitional periods and phases can be traced between them, when central authority weakened and the country experienced serious changes, both internally and externally. Over the centuries, the history of Egypt, like a mighty river, would sometimes widen and sometimes narrow, and all of this in the course of the symbolic river, the waters of the Nile, which in many ways determined the fate of this land. The Nile, this majestic river, is the largest in terms of water flow and length on the African continent, and ranks among the top rivers in the world by length. It originates from Lake Victoria, the largest lake in Africa, whose size is roughly comparable to Georgia or almost Ireland. From this vast water body flows a river known as the White Nile, stretching about 30 kilometers. Further downstream, it meets the Blue Nile, forming a single mighty river near Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. After this confluence, the Nile flows for about another 2,000 kilometers through the heated and often lifeless Nubian and Egyptian deserts, all the way to Cairo, where a vast delta forms and the river breaks into numerous branches, emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. In length, this river is surpassed only by the Amazon, and its length is approximately 6,800 kilometers, which is about 1/6 of the entire circumference of the Earth. The Nile's drainage basin covers about 10% of the land area on the African continent, underscoring its importance and uniqueness for the region. The climate in Egypt is exceptionally arid, the interior regions are practically devoid of precipitation, and history has long shown that the entire existence of the people, animals, and plants in this area was closely linked to and depended on this great water source. If geographic conditions had been different and Lake Victoria had not drained westward, it is almost impossible to imagine how the entire fate of the history of this land could have changed. Over 5,000 years of history, the entire valley and surrounding territories have been a continuous lease of life. Every plant, every tree, every animal, every human and their call. Tour, every sacred place and every king all in many ways existed thanks to this inexhaustible river. In reality, Hamani, Russian presence on the territory of Egypt is one of the oldest on the entire planet. After the appearance of modern humans on Earth, it was these lands in East Africa that became the starting point for the migrations of numerous peoples who later settled all over the world. The Nile can be conditionally considered its ancient pathways, along which humanity's multi-stage journey passed through dangers and trials, be it invasions by the sea peoples or other threats. One of the most striking facts is that it is precisely in this region that the remains of the earliest humans living on Earth are found. Archaeological excavations have uncovered stone tools created at the early stages of human development, dated to about 600,000 years ago. 500,000 years ago, the first true humanity appeared in Africa. Its representatives, the ancestors of modern humans, began migrating south and west. And approximately 100,000 years ago, modern Homo sapiens came to the African continent. These migrations undoubtedly took place during wet periods, times when millions of years ago the climate became more favorable, and serious changes occurred on Earth. During such wet periods, some desert territories, for example, the Sahara, turned into green meadows and pastures, nourished by rains, with diverse flora and fauna. It was precisely then that people inhabited these places, hunted, gathered fruits, and transformed the surrounding nature into their living zone. However, as soon as the wet period ended, the climate abruptly changed, and the desert, intensified by drought, returned to its usual, familiar state for its inhabitants, a dead and lifeless space. During these periods, vegetation greatly diminished, animals moved to more favorable places, and only by the next wet period did the land fill with life again. This entire cyclicity of climate changes not only created conditions for human migrations and development but also shaped the unique history of life in the Nile Valley, which became a cradle for people and their cultures. According to archaeological research, this cycle of natural phenomena and processes has repeated more than 200 times since the formation of the desert in the territory, which approximately 8 million years ago was a green and fertile plain. The ancient tribes inhabiting these lands at the time led predominantly hunting and fishing lifestyles, leaving behind a rich heritage in the form of numerous archaeological finds and artifacts. Over centuries of their existence, primitive tools appeared on stone, and on rocks, the first petroglyphs, evidence of their spiritual beliefs and everyday concerns. Around 13,000 years BC, during one of the driest and harshest periods in the history of the Sahara, a culture known as Sabellian began gathering wild grains of wheat and barley. Gradually, thanks to this, they domesticated and cultivated their own varieties of agricultural crops adapted to the climatic conditions. Approximately 9,000 years BCE, people learned to make threads from animal wool, which became an important step in the development of textile production and domestic needs. At the same time, a new wet period began in the region, which significantly changed the climatic conditions and led to the restoration of vegetation. Within the modern boundaries of Algeria, a mysterious stone circle has been preserved, erected approximately 75,500 years BCE, making it one of the oldest known structures of its kind. At the time this structure was created, the Sahara was a green plain with hillsides covered with lush grass and forests. It is believed that this monument served as an observation post for tracking the starry sky, changes in constellations throughout different seasons, which allowed inhabitants to determine optimum times for sowing, harvesting, and animal migration, all those natural cycles vital for survival. Similar true. The monument is often compared to the Egyptian Stonehenge, but these comparisons are not entirely accurate. the monument on the territory of modern Algeria was built at least 5,000 years earlier than the Grand Megalithic Complex in England. At the end of the last ice age and during the process of global warming, the Sahara Desert once again shrank and dried up, forcing the population of this region to leave their usual habitats. People wandered through the newly formed endless desert until they reached the only oasis where grass was green and waters flowed. There they found shelter and began to create sedentary settlements, which over time grew upwards, expanding along rivers and ravines. In an effort to preserve these favorable conditions, people resettled to river valleys, where they formed increasingly larger settlements, which grew into cities and then into entire states. This path of growth and development led to the formation of the first large state in these lands. The ancient Egyptians called the entire region the Two Lands, from the southern part, where a long valley of the Nile River stretched, to the northern part, its estuary, which opens into the sea. These two parts conventionally divide the modern state of Egypt into Upper and Lower Egypt. It is amazing that for the inhabitants, oriented to the north, the usual perception of the world was completely different. The word that meant east coincided with the word meaning the left side. And the west was equivalent to the right side for them. In their coordinate and orientation system, opposites were constantly present, and they always looked upstream, that is, toward the south, expecting the river floods that brought fertility. If this seems confusing to you, just keep in mind that southern Upper Egypt was indeed upstream, and northern Lower Egypt was downstream. For many people of those times, the lands along the Nile banks represented a whole world with their own unique life. The Egyptians called the river floodplain Kemet or Black Land. This name arose because of the rich dark soil left behind after the annual floods, the bountiful inundations that made the land especially productive and fertile. At the center of this world ruled a deity with the head of a falcon, a symbol of life, protection, and healing, a god whose power and blessing were an integral part of the lives of the Egyptians. In the era of the Late Kingdom, when the struggle for survival became particularly acute, these lands were an arena of constant challenges and changes. And if you were to step away for a minute or an hour in any direction, you could find yourself in a region the Egyptians called Dahat or Red Land, a peripheral desert territory saturated with its own mysteries and dangers. This tract of land was a lifeless, barren desert stretching in all directions. Its hot, blazing sand was practically devoid of water and shade, making this place completely unsuitable for the existence of most forms of living creatures. Power here was held by a deity of chaos and violence, a god the ancients called Grey and Merciless. In these vast sands and rocky expanses, the Nile River was known only as wind or, in some instances, simply as the river, because in their world there was no other source of water. It was in Upper Egypt, far upstream along this great watercourse, that the first axis of civilization originated, its roots stretching into the area now known as Aswan. There, where mighty granite intersects the landscape, water meets its first barriers, millions of small rapids flowing over stones through rocky streams, which in ancient times were called cataracts. This word comes from the Greek kataraktes, which translates as a waterfall rushing downwards. Today, these natural obstacles are held back by a dam built in Aswan, but in deep antiquity, they represented a continuous force, beyond human control. Every time the floodwaters entered the rocky part of the river, a roar awakened. It seemed that the earth itself shook. Roars under this noise. These natural phenomena led the ancient Egyptians to believe that waters rose from the depths of the earth, squeezing through vast underground seas and hidden springs. In Aswan, to honor this primal force, a temple was built on an island amid the raging waters, where people offered prayers and legends to this mighty element. The swift and turbulent current at this place served as a natural barrier to navigation, making further progress along the river impossible. This is why, for much of early history, the boundary of Egyptian civilization was precisely here. Beyond Aswan began the southern regions, which the Egyptians called Nubia. It was like a narrow gateway opening the way to the south. The island with the temple at the Aswan waterfalls was one of the most significant and mystical sites in the history of ancient Egyptian culture. The waterfalls here were known as Abu, which in the Egyptian language meant elephant. This term migrated into the Greek language, where the place became known as Elephantine. In these areas, trade in ivory was established with neighboring southern countries, rich in resources and diversity. Herodotus wrote that all the land north of Aswan was considered part of Egypt, a land irrigated and fertile, literally soaked with the ancient Nile. The entire territory below Elephantine, the city where inhabitants drank river water, was regarded as an inseparable part of the Egyptian state. This region was like an oracle, a symbol of lineage and power, bestowed from above. Generally, it was very fortunate for the Egyptians that the Nile flows from south to north, while prevailing winds blow in the opposite direction. This allowed them to use the winds to effortlessly sail upstream and reach Aswan. The return journey was considerably easier. The combined force of the current and the winds helped ships freely glide downstream, to the south, along the shores. Traveling downstream on the river, a ship heading north from Aswan would, for some time, see only the harsh rocky desert. The waters circumvented numerous rock formations, forming a chain of treacherous rapids flowing through impassable lands surrounded by Nubian sandstone cliffs. These lands were harsh and inhospitable expanses, suitable only for limited use. However, in ancient times they were renowned for their wealth. Precious stones, copper, and gold were mined here. Moving northward along the river, the dam stones and rock formations gradually receded, and the plain and floodplain around the Nile expanded, becoming increasingly wider and more fertile. In this area, the landscape noticeably changes. It seems to be filled with a richer green hue, which, in turn, supports the sustenance of an ever-growing number of inhabitants of this region. In this district emerged the famous city of Phi, which the Egyptians called Oset. Over time, it became one of the most powerful centers of Upper Egypt and took on the role of the capital in the desert-covered regions. The urban quarters, including residential houses, shops, and workshops, were usually located on the eastern bank of the river. Where the sun rises, it was there that children and adults began their day. In contrast, the western bank, where the sun sets, served exclusively as a place for burials and tomb constructions. These lands were designated for interments, imparting a special mystery and sanctity to them. Traveling northward, one can reach the area commonly referred to as Middle Egypt, where the floodplain is even wider and the landscape more varied. This region sparkles with the richness and vibrancy of nature. At the very heart of the Nile Valley, in Africa, there is an astonishing palette of plants and animals, remarkable for its diversity. On the western side, in the area where the Nile waters diverge and form a vast channel, lies the remarkable oasis of Fayum, which, like a large leaf unfolding from the river's stem, stretches along the water. In ancient times, this lake complex served as home to numerous Nile crocodiles, because of which the Greek settlers gave it the name City of Crocodiles or Crocodilopolis. In his accounts, Herodotus noted that the Egyptians even engaged in taming these reptiles right in their temples, turning them into sacred animals. For some groups of Egyptian inhabitants, crocodiles continue to remain sacred creatures. They are the most revered animals, especially for those living near Thebes and Lake Meris. These communities take special care of their tame crocodiles, decorating their ears with stone and gold pendants, putting bracelets on their front legs, as well as feeding them special food and performing sacrificial rituals. Crocodiles are perceived as sacred beings who are cared for and revered. At the same time, in other parts of Egypt, crocodiles are hunted by hunters using various, sometimes dangerous, methods. One such method involved releasing a young piglet tied to a hook into the water. Its screams attracted the crocodile. When the predator grabbed its prey, the hunter pulled it onto the shore, then bent the crocodile's head to cover its eyes with dirt, which made it much easier to control the animal and freed them from difficulties. Among the river inhabitants were creatures that the ancient Greeks called river horses or hippos. In some regions of Egypt, for example, in the area known as Poprimus, these animals were considered sacred beings. This was the name given to the river horse, a quadrupedal creature with cloven hooves like those of bulls, a flat nose, and a strong jaw resembling tusks, as well as a tail and voice reminiscent of a horse. Its size reached that of large bulls, and dried bark from local tree species was used to make shafts for archery. The Egyptians considered this area strategically important, calling it the balance of the two lands, a place where the river divided Egypt, forming the delta, and a connecting link between Upper and Lower Egypt. Here, in the center of this state, sooner or later the city of Memphis would arise, which in the distant nation became the starting point for the construction of modern Cairo. It was in this region that the Egyptians erected some of their most famous and enduring monuments, leaving the world magnificent examples of architecture and culture, whose centuries-old history is inextricably linked with the fate and development of the entire country. Every year, as if by an unchanging schedule, monsoon rains began in the highlands of Ethiopia and Central Africa, leading to significant flooding of the rivers. These natural phenomena regularly occurred in mid-August, and the ancient Egyptians synchronized them in every possible way with the eastern meridian line passing through the rising stars of Sirius. In the 5th century BC, Herodotus left us valuable information about these inundations. He described that when the Nile overflows its banks, it reaches areas located 2 days' journey from any river border and spreads with such force that it floods the nearby lands. This regime lasts for about 100 days, starting from the day of the summer solstice. After this period, the water level gradually decreases, and the river either falls or maintains a low water level, which is preserved throughout the winter until the next summer solstice. The Egyptian calendar divided the year into 3 main seasons: the flood period Ake, the growing season Parate, and the harvest time Shimu. At the beginning of autumn, when the Nile's waters were significantly reduced, the land remained nourished with rich silt brought by the annual flood. It was this fertile layer that allowed the Egyptians to grow wheat, barley, beans, and lentils during the winter months. During the cooler winter days, agricultural work proceeded in full force, and with the arrival of summer, the ripe grains were harvested, and life continued in harmony with this natural cyclicality. The stable balance between floods and droughts was vital for the Egyptians. If the floods were too weak, or conversely, too strong, the consequences for the country could be catastrophic. This is well seen from an ancient hymn dedicated to the Nile: if it is greedy, the whole land must suffer, great and small all suffer, groan, and fall. When the flooding began, people felt joy and gratitude, as the land was filled with the balsamic breath of water. Everyone could hear the jubilant cries, and even the sternest and most unyielding could not help but smile. The Egyptians felt so acutely their dependence on the annual floods of the Nile that they invented an entire system for measuring the water level, special devices called Nilometers. These structures were towers with deep internal wells through which the river could freely flow, and on the walls of the towers, scales and markings in Egyptian cubits were inscribed to accurately record the water level. Every year, the people with reverence and excitement reported their observations, checking the water height to predict whether a period of abundance or famine would come, and to take timely measures to protect against possible floods. In the distant pre-literate times, Egypt was divided into 2 parts, southern and northern, both territorially and culturally. In the southern desert regions of Upper Egypt, inhabitants worshipped their god Nekhbet, believing that he was responsible for the natural flooding of the Nile. In those ancient times, Upper Egypt was inhabited by people with dark skin, which indicates a close connection with the southern regions of Nubia and beyond, the whole of Africa south of the Sahara. The inhabitants of this region often had a darker skin tone and belonged to indigenous African peoples. Moreover, sometimes rulers of the southern lands entered into marriage alliances with the royal houses of the northern states to strengthen political and cultural ties. In contrast, the inhabitants of Lower Egypt, located in the north, worshipped the god Wadjet, also known as the Egyptian cobra, a symbol of power and protection. These lands, situated closer to the Mediterranean Sea, were more strongly influenced. The northern part of North Africa and the Mediterranean countries, which was reflected in the external appearance of their population, possibly lighter skin and different features. In this region, there was a more noticeable mixing of cultures and genetic lines, making the inhabitants of Lower Egypt more diverse in terms of appearance and traditions. The kings of Upper Egypt traditionally wore a white crown, which outwardly resembled the shape of a bulb, smooth, elongated, and rising above the head. While the rulers of the north preferred to dress in bright red crowns, decorated with the image of a cobra coiled in a spiral shape. These distinctive headdresses not only emphasized the status of their owner but also symbolized territorial affiliation. Upper and Lower Egypt, which, despite constant changes and uncertainty within their regions, remained different in cultural and political terms. However, the border running along the Nile has always remained unchanged, like an invisible boundary clearly dividing these 2 regions that formed a unified state. The development of these land areas began approximately 3 millennia before our era, that is, more than 5,000 years ago, and during this period significant changes took place in their history. Our knowledge of the life and reign of the first of the known ancient Egyptian kings, Narmer, is limited due to a small number of sources, mainly inscriptions on stones and a few archaeological finds. It is known that his personal name was Min, but he ascended the throne under the name Narmer, a word meaning warrior catfish. This name likely reveals some traits of his character, his strength, determination, and perhaps even warrior courage. Why he chose a name associated with this remarkable creature remains a mystery. However, there are assumptions that it gave him a special sense of protection or power. The Nile catfish, which evoked special admiration among the Egyptians, was a fairly impressive predatory fish. This nocturnal predator, capable. It could reach a length of up to 1 meter and 20 centimeters, comparable in size to a small dolphin. Particularly striking was its extraordinary gift, the ability to produce electric discharges reaching up to 350 volts, which allowed it to stun its prey and hunt effectively. The largest specimens of this species could use their electric discharges to strike even an adult human. The Egyptians were in complete admiration of this unique ability. These mysterious and frightening predators were depicted on their frescoes and paintings, and some scientists even conducted experiments using the weak discharges of the young to combat arthritis. Apparently, King Narmer, inspired by this hunting skill, hoped to adopt some of its qualities: patient waiting, suddenness in attack, or even the ability to instill awe in his enemies. In reality, the only surviving source of information about that time is a stone carving called the Narmer Palette. This artifact contains only a few mysterious scenes. On one side, the king himself is depicted, full length, standing over a defeated enemy, whom he holds restrained by the hair with one hand, while with the other he demonstrates a raised battle mace as a symbol of his power and supremacy. Also on this side, the king is shown wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, which speaks of his victories and consolidation of positions in the northern lands. On the opposite side of the palette is another image, the king in the red crown of Lower Egypt, leading his army into battle, before which lie the fallen enemies. Additionally, there is an image of a bull breaking down the walls of a fortress with its horns, symbolizing strength and invincibility. Judging by this, it was at this moment that Narmer was represented wearing the red crown, indicating his successful unification of the two previously divided parts of the country. In one of the scenes, two mythical creatures with long intertwined necks are depicted, which most likely symbolizes unity. Two parts of Egypt, united into a single whole. This union became the foundation for the newly unified Egypt to rapidly transform into a powerful and influential state, one of the first in human history. At the time when the Egyptian state was forming, the cultural development of the country experienced strong influence and borrowing from neighboring civilizations, which later helped shape the unique Egyptian civilization, rich with a vast heritage and a complex system of symbols. Ancient cultures of Mesopotamia, such as the Sumerians, had a significant impact on the development of ancient Egyptian civilization, leaving an important mark on cultural and artistic heritage. Many palaces built in Egypt were designed based on Sumerian architectural models, and in the field of art, the Egyptians often drew inspiration from Sumerian motifs and ornaments. However, by the 3rd millennium BCE, Egypt had managed to create its own unique artistic traditions and master a writing system that was becoming increasingly complex and original. The Greeks, upon becoming familiar with Egyptian writing, called it hieroglyphs, a term meaning sacred carving, highlighting its sacred character and special value. Egyptian writing represented a complex system combining both phonetic symbols and signs denoting whole words and concepts. For example, the depiction of a person with a raised hand to the mouth could specifically mean the word juice, a widely used lexical unit. At the same time, other symbols were grouped into clusters of consonant S, serving to denote a smaller part of the lexicon, such as names, geographical terms, and rare words. Thanks to this comprehensive approach, hieroglyphs appeared in Egypt earlier than some other writing systems, such as cuneiform created in Mesopotamia. It is likely that Egyptian hieroglyphs arose under the influence of older systems, prototypes created in Mesopotamia. However, samples have been found that indicate the formation of already complex and self-sufficient signs. This suggests that the creation of hieroglyphs could have occurred simultaneously in various places and possibly was the result of the conscious efforts of one or several masters. In particular, the Egyptian sign designating the ruler took the form of a shepherd's staff, symbolizing the pharaoh's role as the shepherd of his people. The king's power in Egypt was associated with the image of the shepherd, and authority was expressed by holding a gilded curved staff, inspired by civilian tools used by shepherds. These rulers were called pharaohs, a universal term etched into the collective memory of the people. The word pharaoh originates from the ancient Egyptian expression per-aa, meaning great house, and over time transformed into a title for any Egyptian ruler. This term became an integral part of historical memory, largely due to mentions in religious and literary sources, including the Bible. Nevertheless, there is no direct evidence that the word pharaoh was used to denote Egyptian rulers until almost 2,000 years after their era of prominence. In the 18th dynasty, which holds an important place in Egypt's history, rulers were called simply kings or addressed by the title His Majesty. However, over time, the term pharaoh became so popular and widespread that it has persisted in culture to this day, denoting all rulers of the country. In religious understanding in Egypt, the pharaoh was perceived as the living embodiment of the falcon god Horus, as well as the son of the sun god Ra. One of the later hymns dedicated to the ruler praised his image, declaring, "The pharaoh, lord of wisdom, whose name is unknown even to his mother. His glory fills the heavens, and his mighty power stretches to the very horizon." The pharaoh is like a celestial bull, capable of destroying everything in his path. His existence is connected with each of the gods, and it is part of a pantheon of high spiritual and earthly power. One of the most well-known aspects of the life of ancient Egyptians was their deep religious worldview, which influenced all aspects of their daily life and cultic practices. A special place in their beliefs was occupied by the procedure of mummification, a complex and costly ritual aimed at preserving the bodies of the deceased in preparation for the afterlife. The main goal of this procedure was to ensure that the soul of the departed would continue to exist in another world, preparing it for eternal life in accordance with the views of the ancient Egyptians. The Greek historian Herodotus, who traveled many times through the land of Egypt, left valuable information about the practice of embalming characteristic of this ancient culture. He described how masters, embalmers, for a fee, skillfully prepared the bodies of the dead. When a corpse was brought to them, they showed the owners wooden painted models, made in the form of figures resembling the deceased themselves. These figurines served as visual aids. They demonstrated the most optimal methods for conducting ritual treatment of the body. There were two variants of mummification methods, one more complex and effective, the other less sophisticated but more affordable. The simplest method was preferred when funds were limited, although it still included elements intended to ensure the preservation of the body. After becoming familiar with these methods, the owners of the body, usually relatives or intermediaries, chose the most suitable way of preparation. The deceased agreed on the cost and conditions, and only then did the embalmer begin work. Herodotus details the sequence of stages of mummification, carefully explaining each action. First, the brain was extracted through the nostrils using a curved metal instrument, often partially pulling it out while partially pushing in. A special medicinal agent was used to dissolve the tissues. Then, using a sharp stone, the origin of which was associated with Ethiopia, an incision was made along the side of the body, and the internal organs, heart, lungs, stomach, intestines, were removed. After that, the body cavity was thoroughly cleaned and washed with palm wine, and then treated with a mixture of crushed spices to prevent decay. Incenses such as myrrh, cassia, and other spices with antiseptic and aromatic properties were placed inside the cavity. After the procedure was completed, these cavities were sewn up, the body was placed under a layer of natron, which absorbed moisture and prevented decomposition, and left for 70 days. After this time, the body was carefully washed, wrapped in a fine cloth that was cut into strips, and set aside for a certain time for final drying and shaping. During this process, their lower seams and surfaces were covered with resin, a material used by the Egyptians instead of glue, ensuring reliable fixation of the tissues. This entire complex mummification ceremony was an expensive undertaking, available only to wealthy circles of society, merchants, officials, as well as the highest authorities, including the pharaoh himself. One of the inscriptions on the walls of Pharaoh Unas' tomb attests to how prayers and blessings might have been pronounced during the rituals. They addressed the sun god Ammonius and the moon god Tetu, speaking of the spirit of the deceased continuing to receive everything he ate, drank, and where he sat, as if he himself were alive. It also mentions that Unas' tomb was a reed hut, his flow was in the marsh of offerings, his feast among the gods, and the water was wine like the sun. In the coming times, Unas was to sail across the heavens like the solar luminary, making his journey through the heights of the sky. The history of ancient Egypt begins with the reign of King Narmer, who founded a new capital, located in the Veri. In a convenient location on the border of two lands, at the mouth of a river that connects with a delta. The city was named Inabukyu, the city of white walls, or Memphis, as it is called in our days. After Narmer, his successors, the kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, continued to expand and embellish the settlement, turning it into a cultural and administrative center. Despite power being concentrated in the new capital, the rulers often traveled between palaces, governing the state, conducting religious and ceremonial rites. Upon their death, their bodies were still returned to their homeland, to the native lands of Narmer, to special burial places under conditions befitting the high status of the deceased. For example, in Upper Egypt, in Thinis, the mummification and burial of rulers were carried out in the local family necropolis, located in the city of Abydos. This ritual continued until a ruler named Hotep II came to power, marking new stages in burial practices and ceremonial culture. He ruled approximately from the 21st century BCE and became the founder of the so-called Second Dynasty of ancient Egypt. It was under his rule that the decision was made to create a new, grand site for the burials of pharaohs, located near the city of Memphis, the center of the new capital. For this necropolis, he chose a territory on the western bank of the Nile River, within a spacious open area that became known as Saqqara. This elevated plateau, rising far beyond the limits of the river's floods, attracted ancient people with its strategic and symbolic significance. Located as if on the boundary between the green, fertile riverlands A and D, the lifeless desert sand, it symbolized the transition between life and death, being one of the most suitable places for the placement of tombs or the city of spirits. For the pharaohs who sought to make their burials clearly visible and noticeable from their new capital, this was yet another enticing advantage. In the following centuries, Saqqara became the most famous burial site, where tombs of many kings, queens, and noble individuals were built, who followed their ancestors into the afterlife. Initially, these tombs featured a shape known as mastaba, large rectangular structures made of mud brick, serving as a promise of immortality and rebirth in the next life. Despite their impressive size, such graves could not accommodate everyone willing, as Egyptian funerary rites at that time remained quite modest. However, over time and with societal development, ambitions in funerary culture increasingly celebrated grandeur. The first signs of this appeared during the reign of a pharaoh named Nechtrik-Djoser. His reign marked a turning point, after which the so-called earlier ancient period of Egyptian history began, lasting over 500 years. Djoser was the son of a ruler named Hasekemu, who managed to restore the unity of Egypt after a long and complex period of chaos caused by uprisings in the northern regions, the Nile Delta. When order was restored, the young sovereign sought to consolidate it and strengthen his position. He decided to leave behind the tradition of constant itinerant travels across the country, characteristic of his predecessors, and focus on creating a stable capital, Memphis. This move allowed better control of the restless northern lands and cemented the new order. During nearly 30 years of his reign, he initiated an extensive program of construction and reconstruction, restoring temples, erecting fortifications along the entire eastern and western lines of the river, creating powerful defensive structures. Yet, the most significant innovation during his rule was a change in the approach to burial traditions. Beginning to build himself a tomb that resembled in shape and size the mastaba, a type of grave already used for ancestors, Djoser left an important mark in histo. And his final resting place was meant to symbolize the transition to new standards of grave monuments. Soon, his chief architect conceived a more grandiose and ambitious project than the previously established structure. This visionary specialist, known as Imhotep, held many important positions in the royal court. His titles included head of the royal shipyard, keeper of the royal seal, and chief architect of all stoneworks. Imhotep was born in the 15th century BCE, and although much of his life is shrouded in myths and legends, some facts about him have been preserved in historical sources. As a man with a wide range of powers and high authority, he became one of the key creators of a new era in Egyptian funerary art. This man was a person of remarkably broad interests and deep knowledge in various fields. He served as a priest and statesman, as well as engaging in fishing. He was also a physician and architect. He became most famous as a magician endowed with extraordinary wisdom. Imhotep is considered possibly the first person outside the royal family whose biography was thoroughly recorded in history. Thanks to his close and trusted relations with Pharaoh Djoser, he played an important role in shaping the culture and architectural traditions of ancient Egypt. The architect called Imhotep was appointed responsible for constructing the ruler's tomb. However, this structure could not have an ordinary appearance. His predecessors built simple clay mastabas, but he decided to bring a more ambitious idea to life. Imhotep conceived building the tomb out of stone. The stone was quarried locally and roughly processed into massive blocks. For Imhotep, this idea seemed truly inspiring, since the mastaba made of stone, located amidst the lifeless desert, appeared to him extraordinarily unique. The durability of this sturdy material guaranteed that the mastaba was able to withstand significant loads, and therefore its structure should not have remained at the achieved stage. When the first part of the structure was completed, Imhotep began experimenting with the placement of smaller tiers on top, which led to the formation of a stepped shape resembling an unusual wedding cake. Initially, he planned to create 4 tiers, but soon his ambitions grew. In the end, as the work was completed, Djoser's tomb reached a height of 6 tiers, which became a real achievement. Perhaps this was the first architectural structure in history made entirely of dressed stone. Its height reached 62 meters, and it could be considered the tallest building of that time on the entire planet. The stepped pyramid, created for the ruler, was finally completed. After the pharaoh's death, his body was customarily buried in a granite chamber located beneath this majestic monument, surrounded by a complex network of tunnels and corridors. Djoser's pyramid became a revolutionary example in Egyptian architecture and challenged subsequent rulers who faced immense difficulties hindering construction. The problems faced by engineers like Imhotep during the erection of pyramids were simply massive. However, even with the most complex tasks, the achievements of these builders seem even more impressive considering that such monumental structures were usually erected in record-short times. Today in Egypt, remains of ruined pyramids can be found. Their construction most often ceased at early stages. This usually happened due to the early death of the pharaoh who initiated their construction and did not manage to complete it. After the ruler's departure, construction rarely continued. The new power inevitably began building its own pyramid. As a result, construction periods usually did not exceed 30 years. Only rulers with very long and stable reigns could pride themselves on were alive until the completion of the construction of their grand monument. Before the installation of the last capstone, many significant events took place in the history of ancient Egypt. After the death of Djoser, the throne passed to the new pharaoh Sekhemkhet, who is believed to have been his brother. His reign also left a noticeable mark in history, as he began the construction of his own step pyramid, hoping to surpass the achievements of the previous ruler and leave a worthy monument to his reign. When Pharaoh Sekhemkhet died just 6 or 7 years after his solemn ascension to the throne, the first level of his pyramid was only half completed. Construction was then halted, and the ruler's dreams of fully completing it remained unrealized. A similar fate befell another ruler from Haba, who died 6 years after beginning the construction of his own step pyramid, and this mighty structure was never finished. To create each of these grand structures, the Egyptians employed vast numbers of workers. Up to 100,000 people were required for each pyramid, with about 10,000 working simultaneously. There is a common myth that all these monuments were built by armies of slaves. However, modern historians hold a different view. In reality, slavery was part of Egyptian society but did not play a major role in pyramid construction. As in other ancient civilizations, slaves were mostly prisoners of war, people in debt, or those who had committed serious offenses. Still, slaves were usually employed as domestic servants or, in worse cases, worked in mining, for example, in stone quarrying. They were considered part of the lower social strata and were not trusted to build such important and sacred structures. In fact, archaeological findings indicate that the composition of pyramid builders was much more diverse. There were primarily professional craftsmen, as well as peasants who, during periods of seasonal work, went to construction sites in exchange for rations. The life of an Egyptian peasant was always closely tied to the annual flooding of the Nile River, when floods submerged the fertile fields, leaving them fertile in years favorable for agricultural work and limiting the opportunities to work the land. At other times, when the land was unsuitable for cultivation, the peasants actively participated in construction work, digging canals, and other public initiatives, among which was the building of pyramids. Working for the pharaoh, these people received a triple ration of beer per day and regularly ate meat. Their shifts lasted 3 months, and the workers were divided into teams of 20 people. On the inner sides of some stone blocks used in construction, graffiti with names and nicknames invented by the workers themselves have been preserved. Some of them sounded amusing and creative, for example, Energetic Gang, followers of the mighty White Crown, those who know the pharaoh, drunkards of Menkaure. Apparently, the construction supervisors diligently supported team spirit and wanted the workers to feel healthy competition. Possibly, for good results and moving more blocks, they were promised additional rations of beer or other rewards. The work was undoubtedly hard and tiring. However, over the next millennium, millions of Egyptians were ready to repeat this labor to achieve glory and glorious monuments. Some probably felt a sense of pride in participating in the construction of majestic structures that eternally adorned the landscape of their country. If all went well, they had the opportunity to see the completion of these grand projects. These workers were so respected that when anyone among them died during the construction process, they were buried in tombs within the royal complex. Their bodies became part of the monumental ensemble and remained forever. When the hearts of future monuments. Having given their lives to the erection of these sacred structures, they thereby earned respect and honor that would never have been bestowed upon ordinary slaves, strangers who had no right to such a distinction. Over the following centuries, the activity of constructing these grand tombs required colossal administrative efforts, which, in turn, led to a fundamental reform in the system of governance in Egypt. In earlier times, most high-ranking state positions were held by members of the pharaoh's family, as power was inherited and concentrated in the hands of the ruler's closest relatives. However, to carry out such large-scale projects as the building of pyramids and other monumental structures, it became clear that specially trained and qualified specialists, possessing the necessary skills and knowledge, were needed. In the ensuing years, the functions of state administration related to organizing production and workshops, distributing resources, and overseeing the completion of work were divided among various tiers of managers. These roles were entrusted to the most capable and deserving officials, who rose through the ranks thanks to their honest labor and professional achievements. This transformation is described in detail by Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson, who notes how the approach to governing the state changed. When the construction of pyramids began in Egypt, these structures became an integral part of the country's development, giving new impetus to its culture and economy. They contributed to the formation of a new caste of civil servants proud of their work, for the creation of such monuments required not only strength and skill but also organizational abilities. In one ancient Egyptian text from the era of the 5th dynasty, there is advice that a vizier named Ptahhotep passes on to his son about how to achieve success in governance. In this instruction, he emphasizes the importance of moderation and respect for others, warning against considering oneself superior to one's neighbors because of chosen profession or education. He advises his heir not to disregard the opinions of both the ignorant and the wise, since wealth and the value of knowledge can be found even among servants who can sharpen precious stones and craft jewelry. However, despite progress and development, the failures of the kings who ruled after Djoser could lower the morale of the entire country. Their ruined pyramids, standing in the lifeless expanses of the desert, symbolized the fragile nature of power and could indicate the possible impermanence of the royal dynasty. The step pyramid of Djoser represented a challenge that needed to be answered. Only during the reign of a king named Sneferu did a person appear who was capable of accepting this challenge and responding to it. The full name of this ruler was Harnumat Sneferuaj, which can be translated as Mountain of the Heavens. He was the son of Mot, who in Egyptian religion symbolized truth and justice, as well as a descendant of Snefru and Waja, emphasizing his lineage. In conditions where the sacred essence of Mot embodied honesty, order, and stability, it was she who endowed him with her virtues. In Egyptian mythology, Mot was depicted as a goddess with an ostrich feather on her head, who maintained order in the world by arranging stars and crops in the cosmos, controlling the seasons and ensuring cyclical stability. She served as a symbol of justice and truth, while her opposite, chaos, darkness, and disorder, was often depicted as a huge writhing serpent, symbolizing destruction and uncertainty. Snefru, apparently, was the ideal ruler for his time. His reign lasted for 48 years, an era of stability, development, and prosperity. His rise to the throne is also recorded in later Egyptian sources, such as the Pris Papyrus, which extols his merits and exploits. In these texts it is emphasized that the ruler united Upper and Lower Egypt and was a virtuous monarch who strove with all his might to bring benefit to his country. During his half-century reign, Sneferu earned a reputation as one of the most energetic, decisive, and resolute kings, driven by the desire to leave behind a lasting legacy. As a great builder and architect, he pondered, "Can I create something more perfect than Djoser's step pyramid?" His dream was to build a pyramid with perfectly smooth and polished walls, surpassing all previous monuments and representing the pinnacle of engineering art. At the summit of his aspirations lay the idea of creating a monument that would demonstrate the superiority of Egyptian civilization in architecture, beauty, and durability. The first attempt to realize his cherished dream in stone was undertaken by the famous Egyptian king Sneferu. It was his determination that led to the creation of the pyramid at Mitam, which remains one of the most mysterious and discussed in ancient world history. The question arose as to which ruler, Sneferu himself or his predecessor Huni, was the author of this grand architectural project. Although historians and archaeologists continue to explore this issue, one fact remains indisputable: both rulers could proudly consider this pyramid their own step toward immortality. As for the ancient Egyptians, such structures were not only tombs but also symbols of their power and spirituality. The construction of the Mitam pyramid began in several stages, each requiring considerable effort and precise execution. First, a step structure was erected, resembling the Pyramid of Djoser, the first truly monumental structure, and later the top of this building was covered with a smooth casing of white limestone. This layer gave the building a bright and impressive appearance, enclosing a tall and narrow peak within. The overall effect of this design promised to astonish even the most discerning viewers. For the combination of steps and smoothness created the effect of a harmonious and majestic monument, a symbol of power and divinity. However, at the very peak of completing this grand project, a tragedy occurred. Suddenly, the entire mass of stone cladding, which was supposed to give the pyramid its perfect shape, began to collapse from its outer surface. A mass of shards and bricks scattered in all directions, creating chaos and noise that is hard to describe in words. One can only imagine the feeling of panic and anxiety experienced by the workers. They, taking cover from the falling debris, as well as the onlookers and overseers, were in confusion and horror. Sneferu himself, the king, was silent and immediately gave the order to halt construction work when the tragedy reached its climax. The workers inside dropped their tools and hurriedly left the shelter and the ruins, fearing for their lives. Today, inside the pyramid, the walls of the inner burial chamber remain unfinished. They are damp, untreated, and the wooden supports intended to hold up the structure during construction still occupy their places unchanged, as if reminding that the construction was never completed. Despite the disappointment and loss, Sneferu apparently did not lose heart. He realized that overcoming the damage inflicted this time was no easy task and made a new attempt, setting the goal of building a pyramid. This time, it was to be located on the site of another, lesser-known necropolis in Dahshur, situated south of the main royal cemetery in Saqqara. This new pyramid was planned to be significantly taller and was to have even steeper slopes than the previous one. Once construction began, the workers set the slope angle at 43 degrees, calculating that this would help support the structure and ensure its long-lasting durability. Sneferu himself likely hoped that this time he could finally realize in stone his long-standing dream, to become the creator of Yet Anu, a symbol of immortality. But even this venture was not crowned with success. The project was built on land that consisted of a soft and pliable layer of sand and shale. When the pyramid began to take its desired shape, and its weight reached several million tons, the builders faced an unforeseen problem. The stone began to sink into the soft ground, and cracks started to appear in the walls. It is easy to imagine what a heavy and sorrowful moment this was for the architect and project manager, who had to report this to the king, a man embodying God through his power and might. This message was undoubtedly difficult to deliver and even harder to accept. The workers tried various ways to solve the problem. They reinforced the foundation with new supports, and the sections leaning under the weight were supported by massive cedar beams. But it was all in vain. No measures helped save the project. If the work had continued in its original form, the structure would most likely have simply collapsed, similar to what happened to the first pyramid. It seems that even Sneferu himself, a man of extraordinary strength and wisdom, realized that he needed to find another way. So he allowed his builders to complete the new pyramid with a smaller angle of inclination, only 43 degrees, and its final height was reduced by about 25 meters. Today this pyramid has a distinctive silhouette resembling a snub-nosed hump, which gave it its name, the bent, or curved, pyramid. But despite the patience and efforts, Sneferu himself seemed to remain dissatisfied. He was still searching for that perfect form that would truly express his ambitions and aspirations for immortality. He gave a clear and decisive order to build the last, Grand Pyramid 1 kilometer north of the capital, combining all the knowledge and craftsmanship of his architects and stonemasons accumulated from the experience of the first two granite monuments. Initially, the design of this pyramid was originally developed with a unique incline of 43 degrees, which allowed for a more even distribution of the structure's weight and reduced the load on the foundation. Ultimately, the great Sneferu achieved his cherished dream to create a temple that would not only become a symbol of the pharaoh's power but also secure his fame through the ages. This structure became the first among a series of cult and monumental buildings, acquiring the characteristic shape of the Egyptian pyramid, which later became the standard for all subsequent grand monuments. Its height reached 105 meters, nearly twice the size of Djoser's pyramid, making it the tallest building on the entire globe at that time. The genuine geometric precision of the construction left no doubt among contemporaries and descendants alike, as each of its faces precisely matched the calculations. When the time came for Sneferu's passing, he was buried in this monument built with astonishing craftsmanship, thus creating an eternal symbol of his power and immortality. According to his preliminary plans, the throne in this tomb was taken by his son Khufu, who later entered the ranks of the great pyramid builders of all times and peoples. In his childhood years, the young prince possibly witnessed firsthand how his father, driven by the idea of building 3 pyramids, entered into negotiations with architects. These conversations undoubtedly sounded like music and discussions of complex technical details because the construction of the first 2 pyramids was not an easy task. They had to overcome numerous difficulties and even face collapses. And yet, despite these challenges, the Red Pyramid was finally erected, a symbol of progress and perseverance. In those years, perhaps the young prince, listening to the adults' talks, dreamed of one day building an equally magnificent architectural wonder that would glorify his name. Little is known about Khufu's reign, but one thing is clear: he was inspired by the unwavering idea to raise the Great Pyramid, which would surpass all previous constructions in scale. He especially took into account the mistakes of his predecessor related to the architectural irregularities of the structures he created, and probably inherited some talented specialists who participated in the construction. He chose a site for his tomb located about 15 kilometers northwest of Saqqara, on a protruding limestone plateau, near the city of Memphis and a famous necropolis. This area, known as Giza, became the ideal place to realize his grand plans. When the construction of the Great Pyramid began, many viewed this project with great doubt and mistrust, considering it almost impossible. About 2,300,000 large stone blocks were used during the erection process, each weighing collectively up to 6 million tons. When the first layer was completed, its area exceeded 10 football fields, which attested to the grandeur and scale of the structure being built. The builders mainly used local limestone mined from the Giza Plateau to form the internal structure of the pyramid. The blocks were joined together with a strong lime mortar, to which salt, pieces of tree bark, and charcoal were added, all to ensure strength and durability. Fortunately, organic remains found inside this mortar allow modern archaeologists to perform radiocarbon dating, confirming the accuracy and reliability of the results obtained. Various materials were used during construction. The main framework was made of rough stone, while the burial chamber, located in the center of the monument, was built from massive granite blocks obtained from Aswan. These heavy granite masses were intended to withstand the colossal weight of 1,000 tons of stone placed above, providing reliable protection for the ruler's tomb. Well-processed snow-white limestone blocks for the outer cladding were quarried from Tura. That was located on the opposite bank of the river and had an almost marble-like color. These materials and their fine craftsmanship not only gave the pyramid aesthetic charm but also emphasized the symbolism and grandeur of the technological and artistic standards achieved. In ancient times, the Egyptians impeccably valued the quality and durability of their structures, which is why they chose especially strong and aesthetically pleasing material, limestone, for the finishing of tombs and, in particular, for the casing of the Grand Pyramids. This stone was quarried in underground mines located in a system of tunnels beneath the earth, after which it was cut using special tools. Then it was carefully transported to the banks of the Great Nile River, where it was loaded onto barges intended for downstream delivery. To facilitate the transportation of heavy stone blocks, the Egyptians dug an extensive network of canals, artificial waterways leading directly to the base of the future pyramids. Among them, a special place was held by one such reservoir, called Shohofu or the Khufu Basin. It served as an important part of the logistics system of the construction. Papyri have been discovered, representing some of the oldest written sources preserved to this day. These contain detailed records of a work log belonging to an overseer named Mer. These documents allow the reconstruction of details about the technological process carried out during the erection of the Grand Pyramid. Possibly, the execution of the work did not represent particular difficulty but was organized so clearly and cohesively that it impressed contemporaries and historians alike. In Mer's records, his work schedule is described in detail. For example, on the 25th day, he spends the entire day hauling heavy stone blocks to Tura, a place located south of the royal tomb, and spends the night there. On the following day, the 26th, he continues work, loads stones, and goes to spend the night by the Khufu Pond, an important water reservoir located nearby. Already on the 37th day, Mer sets sail with the cargo toward the pyramid and spends the night there, as if securing his work at these majestic structures. On the 28th day, he leaves the pyramid building, heading upriver toward Tura, located to the south. On the 29th day, he again spends time transporting the stone mass, spending the night at the same place, and the 30th day is also entirely devoted to moving the loads. It cannot be overlooked that the pyramids were rigidly oriented to true north, each of their faces pointed precisely to the corresponding cardinal direction. This fact indicates that the Egyptians used astronomical observations, especially stellar measurements, to achieve flawless accuracy in their alignment, as there were no other means to attain such high precision at that time. Regarding the organization of labor, the experts emphasized, there is evidence that the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza lasted approximately 2 decades and 3 years, that is, about 23 years. To complete this massive project, people worked almost without a break, and the last stones were probably laid around the years preceding our era. The pyramid's height reached about 147 meters, equivalent to nearly 40 stories. For nearly 4,000 years, it remained the tallest man-made structure in the world. Later, another architectural object took its place, the wooden spire of an English cathedral in the town of Collingwood, completed in the year 1311, but it lasted just over 200 years before being destroyed during a severe storm. Since then, the name Khufu has entered history due to his involvement in the construction of these majestic monuments. However, besides the pyramid itself, very little information about him has been preserved. The only known image ever found is a small figurine made from ivory. Interestingly, a miniature figurine, only 7 centimeters tall, less than 3 inches, became a rare testament to a man whose grand deeds amazed even centuries later. When Khufu died, around 2525 BCE, power passed to his son Jedefra. However, the newly crowned pharaoh's reign did not last long, and after his death, another son of Khufu, Khafra, ascended the throne. He decided to continue his ancestors' tradition by building his own pyramid next to his father's structure. But for some reason, he chose not to build it higher than the existing building. Perhaps the builders, tired of the endless race to create ever taller and more ornate monuments, told him directly that they were no longer able to raise the structure any higher. One way or another, Khafra had no desire to continue amplifying the already gigantic pyramids, and his construction remained at a height close to that of Khufu's pyramid. Alternatively, Khafra may have had inner doubts about the appropriateness of clearly surpassing his deceased father, who was one of Egypt's most famous and respected pharaohs. Therefore, his pyramid turned out slightly shorter than his ancestors, reaching 3.5 meters less in height. Although he hoped to place it on a slightly higher limestone ledge, which would have allowed it to look more impressive and solemn, his plan slightly diverged from reality. As a result, the pyramid, when viewed from different angles, acquired a more noble and grandeur-enhancing visual form. Along with this, its walls had slightly sharper and more angular sides, giving the entire structure a special character and making it noticeably different from other constructions. It can be assumed that during the erection of his tomb structure, Khafra used significantly fewer stone blocks, approximately 350,000, compared to the cadres traditionally involved in building the pyramids of other pharaohs. And the entire working team, masons and foremen alike, undoubtedly valued this economy, showing respectful attitudes toward such thriftiness. Today, the Pyramid of Khafra remains the only one among the Giza monuments to have completely preserved all its original casing stones, carved from smooth white limestone. These gleaming and smooth surfaces still adorn the upper third of the structure itself, attesting to its exceptional state of preservation. Probably, the reason for this undamaged condition is that the steeper slopes of its sides made access difficult for looters and vandals, rendering the pyramid more protected due to its architecture. As a result, we can imagine how these architectural masterpieces looked in their era, in the prime of their beauty. Their smooth, snow-white surfaces, sparkling under the blazing sun, create an effect of pristine purity, and at night, under the moonlight, they reflect a silvery glow like mirrors. Perhaps the tops of these pyramids were crowned with a special stone, the so-called pyramidion. Normally, it was carved from durable minerals such as diorite or granite, and was decorated with hieroglyphs incised on its surface. Some of these pyramidions, found during excavations, bore characteristic grooves or channels, suggesting the presence of decorative metal strips that framed them. The pyramid tops, adorned with these pyramidions, might have been covered with copper or a glittering alloy electrum, which was a mixture of gold and silver, giving the summits a special brightness and solemnity. Although pyramidions for the Giza pyramids have never been discovered in their original form, it is supposed that their summits could initially have been surrounded by a metal covering or ornamentation. In that case, these monuments would have looked especially spectacular, their sparkling peaks seemingly reaching celestial heights, creating the impression that they were connected to higher worlds. About a century or a bit more passed after the completion of the first. The Step Pyramid of Djoser, and during this time all the largest tombs of Egypt were built. It was an epical period, achieved in just 3 generations of the same dynasty. However, almost immediately after the completion of the last works on the massive construction of Khafre, it became obvious that interest in such grand monuments began to wane. Around 2,500 years before our era, Pharaoh Menkaure, son of Khafre and grandson of the famous Khufu, decided to erect his own pyramid in Giza. The size of this structure turned out to be significantly smaller than the Great Pyramid and even smaller than the Step Pyramid of Djoser. There is an opinion that this was due to the fact that Menkaure probably did not expect a long reign, and therefore did not plan to spend much time building such an impressive tomb. According to one of the traditions recorded in ancient sources and preserved in the stories of Herodotus, this pharaoh was predicted to have a short reign. Because of this, he decided to make the most efficient use of the time and strength available to him, to manage to build at least something worthy. Instead of spending years completing a grand pyramid, he considered it more reasonable to erect a relatively small burial chamber, which would become his final resting place. In his messages to oracles, Menkaure lamented that God allowed him to leave life too early, and expressed bewilderment that his father and uncle ruled the country much longer. Wishing to avoid responsibility for the brevity of his reign, he sought comfort in pleasures, because, in his view, the sooner his reign ended, the sooner he could move on to the afterlife he had envisioned, without engaging in complicated construction works. He gave the order to create many special lamps, which were lit at nightfall, filling the darkness with a soft, flickering light. These light sources were meant to allow a person to enjoy life, expressed and in pleasant conversations, a glass of wine, and general merriment. Throughout the day and night, he tirelessly sought out new hobbies, as if wandering through marshy lowlands and dense groves, carefully choosing the most picturesque and cozy places for rest and entertainment. One can have different attitudes toward these tales, but one thing is obvious: Menkaure's priorities differed greatly from those of Khufu and Khafre. His more modest pyramid seems to have shattered the established myth of the greatness and power of his lineage, becoming merely a reminder of comparative simplicity and transience. Over the next millennium, pharaohs continued to build pyramids as symbols of their power, but their sizes gradually decreased, and the approach to construction became increasingly restrained. In later times, monumental constructions economized on material, and instead of sturdy limestone walls, only thin stone facings appeared with internal filling made of clay bricks or even simple earth and sand. As a result, these ancient monuments presented a bleak sight, solitary, half-ruined giants standing in the boundless desert, like a reminder of past grandeur long lost. This tradition gradually began to fade, giving way to new views and customs. However, it did not disappear completely. Certain elements related to pyramid construction were preserved in subsequent eras. The reasons for ceasing their construction were not only changes in Egyptians' religious views on burial rites and the afterlife but rather increased fears of robbers. After all, the pyramid served as a powerful symbol, a gigantic beacon to the world, inside which lay a mighty and wealthy ruler of Egypt. Since ancient times, people had tried to penetrate the tombs of departed kings, hoping to steal their treasures. One of the inscriptions left by the royal architect named Ini gives a clear understanding of shifting priorities. This text states that he built his king's tomb not for the demonstration of power and wealth, but with completely in secret, away from prying eyes. He writes that he led the excavations of the Royal Majesty's rock tomb alone, and no one saw or heard any thing about his work. Despite such secretive measures, robbers continue to remain a constant threat. For the rulers of late Egypt, this became a very serious problem. Once, one of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom era ordered a thorough inspection of the tombs of his predecessors, and when the inspectors returned, they reported disturbing news. In one of the tombs, it was discovered that it had been damaged by intruders. The intruders had drilled a hole into the main chamber, penetrated through the wall of the sanctuary, and stolen the king's body. Moreover, the tomb of his wife Nuptisa was found completely emptied. All valuables, jewelry, and gold ornaments had been stolen. The traces of the robbers remained vivid and noticeable, emphasizing their cruelty and determination. However, in addition to rich treasures, other valuable items were often stored inside the tombs, often associated with afterlife wealth and serving for eternal life. As discovered by a supervisor named Murer, one of the most labor-intensive tasks in pyramid construction was the quarrying of large blocks of limestone, which was carried out in special quarries located in the area of Tura. Occasionally, due to a lack of time and resources, pharaohs resorted to a rather cruel and primitive method, robbing neighboring, already built pyramids to speed up the construction of their own monuments. In one of the Middle Kingdom texts known as the Instruction of Maracare, there is important advice for future kings: do not plunder the monuments of your ancestors, it is better to obtain stone from the quarries of Tura. It also explicitly states that tombs should not be built from the remains of ruined monuments, using existing structures for this purpose, since this is regarded as a shameful act and a violation of ancient curses. Instead of erecting their magnificent pyramids in Saka, Re or Giza, the predecessors of the Egyptian pharaohs found a more convenient and, possibly, a more suitable place for their burials. Gradually, with the development of the era, the ancient rulers of the country decided to come closer to nature, choosing for their burial complexes the area now known as the Valley of the Kings. This unique necropolis, one of the greatest monuments of ancient civilization, was called in antiquity the Great Field or, according to some ancient sources, the Million Years of the Pharaoh, emphasizing its historical significance. In this place rises the famous rock formation, which, due to its shape and character, received the name Melkern or Roke. This massive and impressive outcrop dominates the red cliffs sheltering it, creating a unique landscape. If you look at it from the side of the tomb entrances, this pointed, neatly outlined peak seems like a natural pyramid stretching towards the heavens. Perhaps the shape of the relief made the task easier for the Egyptians, using the natural features of the landscape to build their tombs. Such a natural design gave them relative simplicity in construction work and at the same time symbolized the connection of man with eternity. It is possible that this rock outcrop provided the ancient Egyptians with a convenient place for burials, as well as releasing significant energy and resource potential. Freed from the need to build massive pyramids, they took a time out to breathe a sigh of relief. And, to change the times and set priorities, gradually the era of pyramid building, which had become an integral symbol of the power and glory of ancient Egypt, began to fade into the past. These grand monuments, embodying the magnificence of the pharaohs, left an indelible mark in history, and subsequent centuries were characterized by the continuation of royal constructions, albeit on a smaller scale, but with the same zeal. However, already in the 6th dynasty, around the 2nd millennium BCE, the speed of construction, the number of new monuments noticeably decreased. Such changes were largely explained by the Gr. owing decentralization of the empire's administration and the gradual weakening of central authority. As a result, at the end of the Old Kingdom era, the grand epic of monumental constructions came to its final stage. The last pharaoh of this period was Pepi II, who ascended the throne at a very young age, only 6 years old, and ruled for over 60 years. Despite his youth, he showed activity and energy, as evidenced by records found in one of the tombs belonging to his official named Harku. This official, during his career, became the mayor of one of the southern provinces of Egypt, located near the area of the Nile Cataracts in Aswan, the southernmost narrow point leading south. The most significant event in Harku's life was the conduction of 4 expeditions organized on behalf of his sovereign. They were carried out along the Nile River, and one of them took him far into the heart of Central Africa, in lands that the Egyptians called the lands of the horizon. In his tomb, he left a very detailed report about the course of these journeys. The trip took him 7 months. He returned from the expedition with a rich cargo of goods: incense, ebony, precious oil, grain, leopard skins, and elephant tusks. This journey was highly valued in his homeland, and the young pharaoh Pepi II showed his appreciation by writing a personal message to Harku. Although this letter was likely written on delicate papyrus and disappeared over time, Harku himself felt joy and pride in his service, which he immortalized by inscribing the contents of the message on the walls of his tomb. This moment is eternally preserved in stone and memory. The voice of this young ruler sounded bright and inspiring. He spoke about how important it is to know how to please one's sovereign, how to work tirelessly, day and night, to fulfill all his will and demands. His words conveyed sincere care and devotion. At this time, special place. The person whom Pepi II particularly valued, it could have been a dwarf or a member of the Pygmy tribes living in Central Africa. The Egyptian ruler showed special interest in these small peoples, possibly sharing some important, mysterious connection with them or simply appreciating them for their uniqueness and unpredictable wisdom. In your message, you also mentioned that you brought a dwarf from the land where the people of the horizon dwell, and that he dances like a deity, performing a magical dance. Immediately proceed to the royal residence to bring this dwarf with you. Hurry, because he must be alive, full of strength and health to delight your king. Before boarding the boat, make sure that the best people are around him to hold him and prevent him from falling into the water. His Majesty desires to see this very dwarf more than all the treasures buried in every corner of his domains and lands. However, despite all his importance and efforts, Pharaoh Pepi was not always as effective as he wished. In childhood, apparently, the power and governance of the country mainly belonged to his mother and the great viziers, who ruled the country instead of the young king, giving him the opportunity to grow and learn. When he grew up, the same principle remained. He continued the policy of non-interference in state affairs, delegating the management of all internal and external issues to local administrators. For a long time, power in Egypt was effectively in the hands of the nomarchs, regional rulers appointed by the pharaoh to govern their lands. Gradually, these positions ceased to be non-hereditary. Nomarch families began passing them down from generation to generation, turning their power into hereditary possession. Such family dynasties literally seized control over the regions, and their tombs became increasingly impressive, rich, and intricate testimonies to their might. Even at that time, nomarchs began to resemble the feudal lords, or even minor kings fought among themselves for influence and territorial boundary. Which was reflected on the political stage. Meanwhile, King Pepi himself, once young and full of energy, was now approaching 70 years of his reign. His weakness and fatigue became noticeable, and his increasing detachment from state affairs turned him into a passive observer of his realm. However, although such changes were not always fatal to the state, one unexpected and devastating factor occurred. During this period, Egypt and the entire eastern Mediterranean region were struck by a severe drought that began around 2200 BCE. This climatic crisis was not a coincidence. A similar event had occurred in the distant past, more than 4,000 years ago, and was linked to the fall of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, and possibly even to the disappearance of the Indus Valley Civilization, located in the territories of modern India and Pakistan. In Egypt, there was a gradual deterioration of climatic conditions. The Nile floods, once frequent and abundant, were reduced to a minimum, and agriculture was on the verge of complete collapse. The drought was so severe and prolonged that the lake located in Fayum, which previously reached a depth of 65 meters, completely dried up over the following 5 decades. This led to a sharp decline in crop yields, numerous disasters, and disruptions in the food supply system that engulfed the entire country. Usually, long years of a pharaoh's reign were considered a blessing for the state, promoting stability, development, and prosperity. But when power is prolonged for decades, it can give rise to one of the main problems: an aging ruler whose experience and health begin to gradually fail. King Pepi had many wives, many of whom had already reached maturity and had their own heirs. They all eagerly awaited when that withered old man will leave this world to finally have a chance to ascend the throne and assert his power. Shortly after Pepi's death, around the 2171st year BC, an acute and chaotic period of struggle for the throne began. His numerous heirs, all former claimants to the kingdom, began fighting each other for the right to inherit power. These events led to a powerful crisis of succession that engulfed the entire territory of Egypt. The serpent of chaos, symbolizing destruction and uncertainty, enveloped the kingdom, and for approximately 20 years, no fewer than 17 pharaohs succeeded one another in the country, each striving to consolidate their power and establish themselves among the late favorites of authority. Some of these rulers may have died of natural causes, living to old age, while others were killed by their rivals or enemies. The only one among them who managed to hold the throne for more than a year was King Ibi. His reign was so brief and unstable that during this short period he even attempted to erect a monument, a pyramid in Saqqara, which could serve as a testament to his power. This decision undoubtedly indicated some optimism and a desire to leave his mark. However, despite this, the structure became more of a symbol of the empire's decline than its prosperity. The height of this pyramid barely reached 30 meters, which was significantly less than the earlier monuments of previous rulers. An additional problem was the quality of construction. It was quite superficial and careless, mainly consisting of clay and limestone fragments, as if hastily assembled and clumsy. King Ibi, who according to legend, was to be buried under this unfortunate monument, ruled for only 2 years, 1 month, and 1 day. During this time, he obviously did not have the opportunity to fully control the entire country, as power was disintegrating and the country began to unravel. I will describe by individual regions. While the central authority weakened, autonomous principalities and provinces appeared locally, declaring their independence and beginning to manage their affairs autonomously, often ignoring Rex, TS and even orders from their official government. The tombs of this period no longer tell of the reign or great deeds of the pharaohs, they are filled only with self-proclaimed titles, most likely hastily invented to give them an appearance of significance. Among them stands out the tomb of the powerful Namarch named Ankhthif, which vividly illustrates the very decline of centralized power. In the inscriptions of this ruler, he calls himself the chief protector of the people, a pillar of their security, and the leader of the land, thanks to his active actions, expressive speeches, and clear thoughts. In his inscriptions, he states, "I am the one who spoke in an era when frightened people were silent, when terrible days caused all Upper Egypt to fall silent in anxiety and apathy." Ankhthif recalls the harsh time of famine that gripped the country, when one crisis followed another, shaking ancient Egypt and destroying its foundations. The people were forced to resort to terrible measures to survive, some robbed, some killed, some organized violent raids. And yet, remarkably, in the province of Ankhthif no one died of hunger. Across the entire country, there was a state of a devastated hungry land, resembling a huge hungry locust moving increasingly from north to south in search of any grain. Egypt was once again breaking apart into parts and fragments, as had happened about a century before, when it was united by King Narmer. The roads, as before, were filled with refugees left without shelter and food. At this time, one of the Egyptian writers, who lived somewhat later and was known as Apur, wrote the following: "People, in order to survive, were forced to resort to crime and violence." He told that guards and house overseers prayed to one another, "Let's go and steal." People formed small armed groups, and the peasants living in the delta prepared weapons and weaponry, considering everyone who disagreed with them an enemy. In such an atmosphere, crime engulfed the entire land seized by chaos. Despite the overflowing Nile, all the fields remained empty, for no one could or wanted to cultivate them. Puver describes a deep economic crisis when trade with distant countries completely ceased, and even the most experienced builders, who once erected pyramids, were forced to work on farms. Those responsible for boats and liturgical vessels had to work in the fields, growing grain and vegetables. The time the writer speaks of is an era when people did not go to sea, did not organize voyages and naval expeditions. Under such conditions arose the question, what to do with the cedar trees intended for making ancient mummies? What about the tombs and coffins in which rich and important people were buried? And what about the embalming oil that was previously specially obtained for this purpose? It no longer went to ceremonies or ritual purposes, everything collapsed, disappeared. There was no longer laughter on people's faces, sadness and despair took hold of everyone. If only I knew where the lost joy is, I would cry out, then, oh God, I would surely bring her a gift and try to bring back the former smile and light to people's hearts. Over the 2 centuries that have passed since that long and complex period began, many people continued to dream of a bright future. In this context, one ancient book stands out in particular, the Prophecy of Neferti, which contains a prediction about a coming ruler who can bring an end to civil strife and discord. According to this legend, the future king or ruler will appear in the world wearing a white crown, a symbol of purity and justice, and along with it will come a red crown, which embodies his strength and power. This leader will unite two powerful lands, previously divided, and will bring a new era of stability and peace. Anyone who lived in his time could joyfully anticipate the arrival of this era. His coming will be a staggering blow to those who held power in the East Asians will fall under his sword, and the inhabitants of Levi and other western lands will fear his fire. Those who rise against him will see his wrath, and traitors will stand before his reverence and authority. He is precisely the man destined to fulfill this prophecy, or rather, the one under whose rule it was likely recorded, who was to reunite the fragmented Egyptian realm and begin a new, more stable era. His name was Nefi-Petra, also known as Mentuhotep II. The ruler named Mentuhotep reigned in the ancient city of Thebes, located in Upper Egypt. He was a king leading the kingdom on the eastern bank of the Nile River, about 100 kilometers south of modern Cairo. Thebes, their residence, was situated on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea and was characterized by incredibly sunny and dry weather, making it one of the hottest and clearest cities in the world. Throughout the entire period of the ancient kingdom, this place remained the center of its province, constantly surrounded by domed houses, granaries, and workshops, all concentrated around the main temple of the god Ammonius. The inhabitants of this city clearly aspired to rid themselves of the influence of the kings, whose governance they had to endure from Memphis, the capital of the entire ancient realm. At the same time, despite their fortified positions in the southern part of Egypt, an ambitious and often ruthless rival arose in the northern regions, not far from the center of power. His strength was concentrated around the city of Haionian in Lower Egypt, in the green area between the Nile River and the Great Lake Fayum, which the people of Egypt disparagingly called the marshes. This city would soon become the capital of a new empire known as Heracleopolis, or the City of Hercules. For approximately 100 years, during periods of disintegration and struggle between Thebes and Hainan, there were fierce wars for control over small border territories, important fortifications, and trade routes. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. Everything changed after a king named Mentuhotep came to power in Thebes, bearing the name of an ancient god of war and descending from a powerful line of rulers. He set himself the task not only of ending the prolonged struggle with the north but also of uniting the fragmented parts of the ancient Egyptian kingdom. The climax of the conflict was the uprising in Tinis, a city that once belonged to King Narmer and later came under the control of northern forces in the state of Thebes. Inspired by this event, Nani, the southern state, took advantage of the opportunity and moved south into the desert and barren lands in search of new victories, aiming to capture a strategically important city. Soon, the conflict engulfed the entire country. The northerners advanced one after another deep into southern territory, capturing key locations, among which was the ancient, especially sacred city of Abydos, the center of Egypt's spiritual life, a cult site with magnificent temples and palaces. This capture became one of the most significant events in the struggle between North and South, as after the destruction and brutal ruin of temple complexes and palaces, darkness and chaos hung over this sacred city, leaving behind only ruins and memories of bygone times. One of the later literary texts, called the Instruction of Merakare, was created during the era of ancient Hayan Nisutu, a ruler based in the north. He, it is said, was tormented by remorse for the destruction of the sacred city, which he considered a grave crime. In this work he writes that during my reign a shameful deed occurred, the province of Jos was completely devastated. He acknowledges that, although it was his fault that led to this destruction, he learned of what had happened only some time after the evil act was committed. For the king, this became the true punishment for wrongful deeds, for destruction is an evil to be feared at any cost. He W. warns his followers, beware of this evil, for after every mighty blow, fate will surely respond. And indeed, punishment to some extent caught up with him for these actions. It was a harsh and resounding penalty brought by the royal wrath of 5th Mentuhotep. This great warrior marched north and defeated the army of Phaeonian Nenissa, taking part in a bloody struggle. After this, he launched a campaign against the northern capital, which was conquered in bloodshed. During this conquest, all the funerary monuments of the kings located there were desecrated and destroyed, possibly evidence of the city's plunder and the destruction of its sacred gold, stone, and clay objects. Whatever the northerners might have done to the sanctities of Abydos, the consequences of this clash were even more severe than might have been expected. Suffering and destruction affected both them and their native city with increased force and fury. When Mentuhotep passed through northern Egypt, the residents' governors, upon seeing the message left on the walls, made an important choice: they swore him loyalty and devotion. As a result of nearly 2 centuries of division, the two parts of the great country, Upper and Lower Egypt, were finally reunited, merging into a single whole. This day became a turning point, heralding the beginning of a new period in the country's history. The subsequent centuries were known as the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, lasting about 300 years. However, this period, despite its length, left behind very modest archaeological monuments and records compared to the brilliant eras of the ancient early capital empires and the time of the late New Kingdom. Unlike the grand pyramids, majestic temples, and luxurious tombs erected in earlier times, the Middle Kingdom appears more modest and less memorable. Nevertheless, despite these advantages, for Egyptian culture the most important thing, these are achievements in another direction, in the field of literature and writing. It was during this period that the famous works arose, which became the pearls of ancient Egyptian words: the story of Sinuhe, Tales of Wonders, and the story of the sailor who survived a shipwreck. Thus, the story of Sinuhe tells of a man who set off on a journey to the north, to Palestine and other lands. However, despite all the adventures, over time he began to feel a strong longing for his homeland and decided to return to Egypt. At the same time, a collection of ancient stories was created, known as the Tales of Wonders. It can be considered an early analogue of the famous 1001 Nights, in which fantastic and incredible events were described, as if told to the great pharaoh Khufu himself by his 3 sons. Another widely known story of that time is the tale of the sailor who ended up in a shipwreck. This narrative includes elements of travel and adventure and resembles in structure and spirit the legend of Gulliver. It tells of a sailor who was shipwrecked in the Mediterranean Sea and eventually found himself on a mysterious island ruled by a giant serpent. Judge for yourself: a storm engulfed the seas, the wind intensified, roaring and whistling like an evil predator, and the waves rose in furious rage. In the very midst of this storm, a log struck it, and the ship began to sink. Out of the entire crew that was on board, no one could be saved. Eventually, a wave carried me to a deserted island in the middle of the endless green sea. There, I first met the great serpent, who told me about his bitter fate. It turned out that his family perished when a bright, sparkling star fell to the earth. The serpent, noticing my terrible shock, assured me that I should not be afraid, for soon a ship would find me and send me home. Thus, I found myself in this secluded nature, surrounded by silence and mysteries, and believed the words of the serpent, hoping about salvation. He once said that soon I would be able to tell my amazing story. Hitch could truly inspire. The time I was supposed to spend on this mysterious island was divided into separate stages, first 1 month, then another, and so on, totaling 4 months. This entire period became a unique opportunity for me not only to survive but also to prepare for the upcoming encounter with fate. After all, a ship with sailors I knew well and mentioned in my stories was supposed to appear over the horizon. It was with them that I hoped to return home, to where my life awaited me, or perhaps there I would meet death, surrounded by my native places. Well, how pleasant it is, for a creature living in constant hope and expectation, to share stories about one's situation when torment and suffering seem to fall silent, giving way to hope for salvation. And finally, the predicted ship appeared on the horizon, as if fulfilling all our hopes and prayers. I climbed a tall tree to get a better view, recognized familiar silhouettes on board, and hurried to welcome their return to share this joyful news as soon as possible. After that, I descended to the shore, standing slightly aside from the arriving vessel, and upon meeting the crew, expressed my gratitude to the lord of the island, the man thanks to whom my potential still lived. The sailors, hearing my words, responded with unanimous approval. By that time, our stories already contained many myths and legends, as well as sacred texts created in honor of gods and kings. But this story is not about great rulers or deeds of gods. It tells about an ordinary man caught in an extraordinarily complex, sometimes even difficult situation in which an ordinary person finds himself. It is hard not to notice that this tale seems no more than a funny misconception created for entertainment. It seems as if it was invented just to simply and interestingly tell a story. Perhaps one could argue this is one of the earliest known literary works preserved from around the 20th century BCE, that is, almost 4,000 years ago. In general, historians usually pay special attention to the lives of the great rulers of Egypt, the pharaohs, because they were the primary patrons of inscriptions, monuments, and statues that we can see today. However, with the development of literature during the Middle Kingdom era, it became clearer how the ordinary inhabitants of this ancient Nile Valley lived. Among the many stories of that time, a special place is held by the famous document, the Lansing Papyrus, which is a vivid testimony of the daily life of a common man. It was written by a master scribe for his novice apprentice to persuade him to become a professional recorder. From this text, we can gain a bright understanding of the various ways people made a living in ancient Egypt. The master assures that the profession of a scribe brings more income than other routine tasks and crafts. He compares the work to bread and beer, clothing and oil, as well as to inheritance and a place in the tomb in the West, symbols of peace, prosperity, and eternal life. The master's speech contains a call to look at the surrounding world from his point of view to comprehend the full range of professions existing in the Egyptian valley at that time. Among them are some that seem inconspicuous, for example, a laundress who spends long hours moving back and forth, tiring from constant activity. Every day, she bleaches her neighbor's linen, a troublesome and monotonous task requiring patience and strength. The potter, also known as the clay master, appears as a tired and somewhat sad person. His body is covered with a layer of dirt, and his hands and feet are stained with clay as if he had lived in marshy places. The shoemaker, in turn, is engaged in preparing special tanning lotions to protect the skin from the sun. His hands emit a strong scent, and his skin is covered with red spots, as if his hands were bled with blood. And the florist, who creates beautiful bouquets and decorations for wine. Jugs from bright flowers, works through the nights under the bright sunlight, carefully selecting every branch and petal. Merchants, of whom there were plenty in any era, transport goods from one city to another, ensuring that those in need receive everything necessary. In this chain of labor and exchange, everyone finds their place. And if you have even a drop of courage and determination, consider becoming a scribe, a profession that could become your guide in this world and provide a decent livelihood. It may be difficult to say with certainty how hard and exhausting the everyday life of all Egyptian workers really was, since none of them left behind records sharing their thoughts or feelings. Most of the country's population consisted of peasants and farmers, for whom agriculture was the main occupation. And even if some of them pursued other professions, it is unlikely that the idea of any other activity would have crossed their minds. Farming evidently remained their primary concern. These peasants often did not own the land they worked on but were forced to give a significant portion of their harvest either to the crown or local temples, fulfilling their obligations to authority and religion. To diversify their daily diet, many families kept small vegetable gardens, mainly tended by women while the men worked in the fields, sowing and harvesting. Women in ancient Egypt were also fully responsible for baking bread, the most important food product without which no family could do. Bread in Egypt was usually made from wheat, and the dough was pressed into clay molds and placed in ovens. Sometimes bakers gave the bread unusual shapes, such as spiral curls or animal figures, creating creative and original forms. Baked goods. Those who had the means also prepared sweet pies and cakes from high-quality flour, sweetening them with dates and honey to decorate and make them more appetizing. Besides bread, the Egyptians consumed a variety of vegetables such as garlic and green onions, as well as onions, lettuce, celery, cucumbers, pumpkins, and melons, just a small but important part of their daily diet. These vegetables were supplemented by leguminous crops like lentils and fava beans. They were important sources of high-quality protein necessary for the body. A notable place in their diet was also occupied by products unusual to us, such as tiger nuts, edible tubers that grew at the base of swamps and were valuable and nutritious. All these ingredients were cooked in olive oil, which was considered one of the main fats in their diet. Since the time of the construction of the Great Pyramids, the Egyptians had a staple diet of bread and oil, as confirmed by archaeological finds in ancient texts. Occasionally, types of meat appeared on their menu, most often beef, mutton, pork, and goat meat, as well as poultry, quails, pigeons, ducks, geese, and partridges. In rare cases, even mice or hedgehogs found their way into their diet, which they knew how to prepare with certain ingenuity. For example, by wrapping them in wet clay and baking them in the oven, cracks in the clay helped them remove spines and fur, making the meat quite edible. In addition, the Egyptians produced cheese, and even foie gras from specially fattened geese, which indicates a refined and sophisticated culinary culture. Ancient texts, for example, from the scribe who wrote for Queen Nefertari, emphasized the importance of sharing food with others. One should not eat bread alone if there is someone nearby, it is better to offer them a piece. Food was always present in their lives, being an integral part of existence. After all, humans are not eternal, some are rich, others poor, but what truly mattered was generosity and willingness to share food. In Egypt, beer was an extremely popular beverage that people enjoyed daily. The constant consumption of beer made brewing one of the country's significant industries. It was believed that beer was a gift from the god Hathor, the goddess of beauty, music, and dance, the patroness of this ancient craft. Many breweries were under her protection and were often managed by women, indicating the important role ladies played in this field. Some large breweries could produce over 1 million liters of beer per year, a sign of the advanced development of the food industry. To brew this beverage, large ceramic vats were used, which were placed over an open fire to heat barley and water. Afterward, the mixture was left to ferment, and before adding honey and syrups from dates or other fruits, the beer was usually aged and matured to acquire a special taste and richness. The Egyptians held one of their most vivid and noisy celebrations, an annual festival known in their culture as the Festival of Drunkenness. On the most solemn day of this event, the country's inhabitants gathered in large halls, where they held a feast accompanied by the extensive consumption of beer, which they tried to drink to the best of their abilities. People drank as much as they could endure to feel joy and unity, and afterward, tired and satisfied, they fell asleep right in the huge halls, creating a sense of cozy brotherly community. They were awakened by the sounds of loud drums, and at that moment, it was said that some of them might have met the goddess Hathor herself, the patroness of love, beauty, and merriment. This event served not only as an occasion for celebration but also as a reminder of the rich spiritual life and cultural traditions of the ancient Egyptians. Egypt was one of the most stable and prosperous agricultural societies of its time, thanks to skillful land management and abundant natural resources. In distant times, human existence in this land was based on the collection and storage of the harvest, grains that formed the basis of their sustenance and economic activity. However, these enterprises brought their own challenges, associated with the constant threat of rodents, mice and rats. To protect their reserves, the Egyptians created large round storage facilities with gently sloping roofs, resembling beehives. Freshly harvested wheat or barley, carefully poured through openings at the top of such guarded structures, was kept warm and dry, preventing spoilage. When grain was needed for baking bread or brewing beer, it was taken out through special small doors at the bottom of these storages. But if mice penetrated inside or ate grain in the fields, the labor of several thousand people would become futile, they could lose a rich harvest and face hunger threatening the entire village. Fortunately, the Egyptians always had a reliable helper, the domestic cat, which became their faithful ally in the fight against rodents. Two main breeds of wild cats lived in the country, the reed cat, known as Felis chos, and the African wildcat, Felis libica. Of these two, it was the African wildcat that had a friendlier disposition, which is why it was more often kept at home as a beloved pet. Evidence that the Egyptians domesticated these cats exists from at least 5,000 years BCE. These mammals lived near settlements because of their effectiveness in ridding rodents, as well as their remarkable reflexes that allowed them to deal with venomous snakes, which was extremely important for the safety of the inhabitants. However, the Egyptians valued them not only for their practical benefits, fighting pests and dangerous animals, but also for their attractive appearance and intelligence, as well as for pleasant companionship. Some of their beloved cats could even have their own small burials, where they placed small offerings, believing that these gestures would ensure them a happy afterlife. The Greek writer Diodorus Siculus mentioned how the Egyptians carefully carried out burial rituals for their cats. Several days before death, they performed special ceremonies, gently wrapping the body in a thin cloth made of cotton or linen, and, uttering mournful laments and wiping away tears, they transported it for embalming. After treatment with aromatic oils, cedar oil and spices, which gave the body a pleasant scent and slowed its decomposition, the curious and caring Egyptians placed the mummies in dazzling tombs, imbued with light and reverence. Although the earliest stages of cat domestication took place in other regions of the Fertile Crescent, it was in Egypt that the process noticeably accelerated and took on a special, almost religious significance. Over time, having adapted to their new position in human life, cats began to change significantly, their natural camouflage coloring disappeared, they became smaller in size, and the shapes of their bodies and ways of communicating with people also acquired completely different characteristics. soft meowing began to imitate the voice of a human infant, which greatly strengthened their bond with their owners. The Egyptians gave these graceful creatures the name Maya, and over time, reverence for cats within their culture grew into sincere love and devotion. These animals acquired not only practical but also religious significance, becoming symbols of divinity, protection, and family harmony. Thanks to their elegant grace and lightness of movement, ancient Egyptians associated cats and dogs with femininity and refinement. On frescoes decorating ancient tombs, it was often depicted how a dog quietly sits under a man's chair, and a cat under a woman's armchair, emphasizing their special closeness and importance. Particularly revered was the goddess named Batet, depicted as a woman with the head of a domestic cat. She was considered the guardian of fertility and well-being. Women turned to her during childbirth and pregnancy, asking for protection and good fortune. Later, in historical descriptions, Diodorus mentioned the Egyptian festival during which cats were revered through ritual washings and feedings. At this festival, they broke bread for them, washed it down with milk, and, making cuckoo sounds, offered treats to these animals. Sometimes fish caught in the Nile were prepared and the cats were fed raw fish. Those who encountered these animals often fell to their knees before them, expressing reverence and respect. The Egyptians showed not only religious veneration towards cats but also extreme protection. Diodorus recounted cases when the killing of a cat, whether intentional or accidental, led to immediate punishment, often the death penalty. Crowds of strong men would gather in the streets demanding justice, and criminals were executed in the harshest way, sometimes without trial. For many centuries, caring for cats remained a vital part of Egyptian culture, and the veneration of these animals was an integral part of the heritage that Egyptians always kept in their hearts. The Middle Ages in Egypt were not only a time when kings and pharaohs engaged in building great pyramids but also a period of significant changes. During the time when the volume of pyramid construction somewhat decreased, some pharaohs turned to implementing other large-scale projects aimed at strengthening and developing the empire. For example, one of them concentrated all efforts on creating an extensive irrigation system around the Fayum oasis. This grand endeavor involved transforming arid desert land into fertile grounds capable of feeding a large population and supporting agricultural development. Another pharaoh built an impressive chain of defensive walls along the Nile Delta to protect Egypt from possible invasions from the Near East, whose inhabitants were then called Asians. These foreigners were often depicted in drawings with lighter, yellowish skin and were considered barbarians, ignoramuses, and primitive peoples lacking a high culture. The Egyptians regarded them as unacceptable to competitors and a threat to their civilization. Soon Egyptian influence expanded northward, along the Mediterranean coast and into Palestinian lands. The Egyptians crossed the Sinai Desert border and captured a Phoenician city called Byblos. Then their expansion shifted southward into the lands of East Africa, which the Egyptians called the lands of the horizon or Nubian lands. These lands differed from Egypt in skin color and facial features. Nubians typically had darker skin with pronounced African traits. At that time, states south of Egypt were in the nascent stages of development and represented unstable, weak structures, easily accessible for expansion by Egyptian troops. It is known that the first cataract of the Nile is located at Aswan, where granite rocks form a series of swift rapids, creating a serious obstacle for navigation. The Aswan area is known for its rich stone resources and rare water flows. If an ancient Egyptian decided to travel upriver, leaving Aswan and moving further along the current, he would encounter 5 more significant cataracts. These sections, where the river becomes shallow and the current more complex, served as natural barriers and boundaries for travelers. It was here that vessels or boats encountered difficulties, and these cataracts simultaneously formed natural divisions, borders along which river travel became increasingly difficult. During the Middle Kingdom of ancient Egypt, the country repeatedly embarked on military campaigns in the north, expanding its borders and strengthening its positions. During this period, the Egyptians made significant progress to the south, reaching the Second Cataract, a boundary designated for the protection of southern lands. Mainly around the 19th century BC, one of the rulers of this time, a king named Senusret II, undertook an especially large expedition to the south, conquering the Nubian kingdoms of Kush and Punt. His military campaigns are reflected in one of his inscriptions, where he proudly narrates, speaking about his actions, "Nubians, scoundrels, and cowards. My Majesty has seen all this. These words testify to the harsh reality of those combat clashes. In fact, the king not only seized lands but also terrorized the population, taking women captive, forcing subjects into submission, poisoning their water sources, and destroying crops, all to strengthen his power. In the process of conquests and border expansions, Senusert II built a network of fortresses along the southern borders, powerful fortification structures, the purpose of which is revealed by their names given by the Egyptians. One of these fortresses was As-Uta, named to signify the destruction of the Nubian troops, and another, located in the Shalfak area, functioned to subdue foreign lands and establish Egyptian control. In a more distant fortress, located more than 400 kilometers from the former Aswan borders, a stone monument with a triumphal inscription left by Senusert during his reign has been preserved. In the 16th year, in the third month of winter, the king declared that he had secured his southern border, a border that he established further south than that of his father. In his inscription, he emphasized that he added to the grand legacy bequeathed to him, "I established the border southward, beyond the border of my predecessor. I expanded what was entrusted to me. As for my son, if he supports this border and defends it, he is my heir. But whoever leaves it unprotected or does not fight for it, that one is not my son, he was not born by me." This message, clearly filled with confidence and becoming part of the hereditary tradition, underlines the importance of loyalty and protection of the achieved frontiers. To hold the southern territories, the kings supplied the fortresses with detachments of Egyptian soldiers, a reserve intended to maintain order and discipline among the newly subdued Nubians. Under conditions of paranoid control and constant surveillance of the local population, Pharaoh Senusert regularly received reports and on papyrus scrolls. Information was gathered about the movements and actions of even the smallest groups of Nubians, some of whom occasionally managed to preserve themselves and hide. One such report spoke of a patrol dispatched from the fortress of Hoses, located on the edge of the desert. In the third year of his reign, during the third month of the growing season, a messenger named Midjiv returned with a report about discovered tracks, the tracks of 32 people and 3 donkeys. All such reports, regardless of the region, ultimately confirmed that all matters of the Egyptian domain remained intact and free from threats. However, despite promises of security, the pharaoh's dissatisfaction was still palpable. He was known for his love of sculptural art and personally created many unique statues from black diorite, depicting himself with astonishing realism that had no parallels in previous eras. In these statues, his ears are elongated to enormous proportions, possibly to convey some secret message or to emphasize a special perception of the world that he discreetly demonstrated. These 3 statues depict him at different periods of life, youth, maturity, and old age, allowing us to understand how the perception of power in the ruler's inner state changed over time. Particularly remarkable is the last, the oldest of them, a statue made in the late stage of the pharaoh's life. In it, his face appears emaciated and tired, and his eyes sunken, as if he bears the weight of all responsibility and the constant tension caused by the complex and paranoid system of state governance. The expression on his face testifies to numerous worries and unrest that accompanied him throughout many years of his reign. In the end, these 3 statues became not merely works of art or monuments but a kind of metaphor for the state of the Middle Kingdom in the last years of its existence, a time when internal anxieties, illnesses, and concerns about the preservation of the borders increasingly shared power with the ruler and his subjects. The son of Senusert, Amenem II, continued to strictly adhere to his father's teachings and successfully defended Egypt's southern border from Nubian raids. However, after his reign, the country once again faced a serious crisis related to issues of succession, which was so complex and deep that it caused a unique event in history: a woman claiming the title of pharaoh ascended the throne. This was something extraordinary for the Egyptian civilization at the time, where power was traditionally passed to men, and women rarely managed to become rulers. Her name was Sobekneferu, and she most likely descended either from a former pharaoh or was his daughter, or possibly sister or even wife of the previous monarch. Although she may not have been the first woman to gain power in Egypt, she was the official bearer of the king's title, which was a rare and unusual case in the country's history. In her inscriptions and memorial signs, Sobekneferu often used male titles, indicating her intention to emphasize her authority, and one of her statues depicts her in an unusual combination of male and female clothing. Despite all her efforts and symbolism, she failed to stop the gradual decline of the dynasty. During her 4-year reign, she did not manage to leave heirs, and after her death, power was once again in the hands of snakes and luminaries, forces representing darkness and chaos. Egypt found itself in a state of complete disintegration, and the country plunged into a period of crisis known as the Second Intermediate Period. This segment of history lasted about 150 years and was marked by powerlessness, increased fragmentation, and significant weakening of centralized authority. During this tragic period, according to archaeological findings, no fewer than 50 different kings ruled the throne, each fighting for his place under the sun. Egypt was again divided into two parts, Upper and Lower, and Man. Why rulers per? The title of king began to be mentioned in their inscriptions, which testified to the complete collapse of the country's unity. The pyramids of this time became lower and more modest in size, often built from mud bricks, and their construction practically ceased altogether. Some royal burials were simple stone mausoleums, while noble people were forced to bury their relatives in rudimentary shaft tombs, hardly distinguishable from the burials of commoners. At that time, most of the Nile Delta, especially its lower part located in Lower Egypt, had long been separated and ceased to be part of a unified empire. In the south, in the region of Nubia, a mass uprising of the people was taking place, and gradually the Egyptians were forced to concede their southern fortified forts to the Nubians. These fortifications, once symbols of the power and confidence of the Egyptian state, turned into important military bases for the Nubians, places for constant raids that penetrated deeper and deeper into Egyptian territory. The cruelty and intransigence of the Egyptians in the conflict with the Nubian people ultimately turned against the Egyptians themselves. Military clashes engulfed not only the southern and northern borders but also disrupted the vital trade routes that connected Egypt with the outside world, significantly weakening the country's economy and political stability. It was precisely during this period, possibly a little later, that events took the stage which changed the course of world history, a powerful natural catastrophic event. As a consequence, or exactly during this period, the eruption of the grand volcano Thera, known today as the Greek volcano Etna, occurred. Located only 700 kilometers from the Egyptian coast, this volcano could provoke an emergency situation with potential effects on the entire Mediterranean region. Recalling the eruption of the Krakatoa volcano in Indonesia in the 18th century, which was heard over 3,000 kilometers away, the eruption of Thera, according to scientists, was at least 4 times more powerful. Modern research shows that the crater formed after this eruption is now filled with seawater and has a width of over 10 kilometers. As a result of the most powerful atmospheric ejection, at least 40 million cubic kilometers of rock and ash were expelled. The volcanic plume stretching over the region was a dense black mass of ash, and electrical discharges causing lightning could have occurred in its upper part, exacerbating the destructive effect of the disaster. Such a powerful natural explosion would undoubtedly have left behind traces of an indescribably destructive force, the consequences of which could have been felt throughout the region and far beyond. This catastrophic scenario represented a chain of destructive natural phenomena that could have led to a large-scale tragedy. As a result, the height of the enormous tsunami could have reached 10 meters, flooding coastal areas, destroying homes, infrastructure, and annihilating everything in its path. Such a natural disaster would have become a catalyst for the onset of a volcanic winter, which is essentially a prolonged period of temperature drop caused by the massive volume of ash and soot thrown into the atmosphere. It is unimaginable, the eruption could have instantly destroyed the Minoan civilization that thrived on Crete. This event could have been the reason for the emergence of numerous legends about gods, heroes, and the fates of sacred people, as humanity tends to seek explanations for extraordinary phenomena in myths. And even in ancient sources, such as the myth of the sunken Atlantis or Chinese chronicles, mentions can be found of periods when the sky suddenly turned a strange yellow color, and harvests across the land almost vanished. One of the ancient Egyptian inscriptions, called the Element of the Storm, possibly holds the memory of that horrific event that shook the world then. The gods clearly expressed their displeasure, and in response, the heavens answered with a storm, as if the enraged forces of nature responded to their call. As a result, the western lands were plunged into darkness. Powerful whirlwinds, stronger than water tornadoes in Aswan, swept across the entire region, tearing down houses, villages, and shelters, flooding everything in their path, as if floating on the surface of enormous papyrus sheets. For some time, the elements raged, and the ash, which in ancient times was called Typhur, began to cover everything around. Today, its particles can be found almost anywhere in the eastern Mediterranean, a testament to the ancient catastrophe. These natural disasters, exacerbated by the sudden fall of Egyptian power, led to famine and exhaustion. But perhaps mysterious forces were already appearing on the horizon, aliens striving to subjugate Egypt and establish their rule. These extraterrestrial beings were known by the name Hyksos. The name Hyksos comes from the ancient Egyptian term Hekaukasut, which meant rulers of foreign lands. The exact origin of these people remains a mystery to this day, but it is believed that they probably appeared in the area of present-day Syria. Their military achievements were impressive, as the secret to their success was likely an important invention, the chariot. For many centuries, similar means of transportation had already been used in various civilizations. For example, on the Sumerian standard, which was created in Ur around the time the pyramids in Giza arose, are depicted transport vehicles, war carts with 4 sturdy wooden wheels, harnessed by donkeys. However, Egypt never used this type of transport at that time. Their technology had developed significantly over millennia. The first chariots brought by the Hyksos to Egypt were distinguished by having only 2 narrow wheels, making them very light and fast. Each such chariot was pulled by 2 strong animals, horses, which had only recently appeared in these regions. These mobile battle platforms became powerful weapons in the hands of warriors. On board were archers armed with powerful bows. Ami, who could shell enemies from a sufficient distance, creating chaos in their ranks. What causes debates among scholars today is how exactly the Hyksos got into Egypt. Were these sudden, violent invasions, or more routine migrations that occurred over a long time? In fact, for centuries, people from the north settled in the Nile Delta. By the time the Hyksos began seizing lands, most of the region's population was already considered foreigners, strangers in their own land. Despite this, the Hyksos were not particularly inclined toward peaceful coexistence. They established their state in the Nile Delta, choosing the city of Avaris as their capital. Their appearance dealt a real blow to the morale of the Egyptians, as they moved south to capture Memphis, an ancient and very important capital. Later sources, such as the Maniphon, one of the ancient manuscripts, describe in detail the events that took place during that dangerous period, creating an image of grand but tragic changes in history. Historical sources tell of the invasion of the Hyksos, peoples who came to Egypt and captured it without subjecting the country to bloodshed, during which they expelled the Egyptian rulers, destroyed cities, and leveled the majestic temples of the gods. These foreigners decreed to establish their king, one of those who had a residence in Memphis, and introduced a tax system equally mandatory for both parts of the state, Upper and Lower Egypt. The most important strategic points, including the capital cities, were occupied by their garrisons. The enormous pyramids, symbols of the power and authority of the Egyptian pharaohs, were now in the hands of the invaders, depriving the country of its national pride. Egyptian rulers were forced to retreat to their former center, the city of the Bes, by then heavily fortified. As the power of the Hyksos grew in the south and a new threat appeared from their chronicled kings located in the north. In the end, the Egyptian people felt their weakness and defenselessness growing, as if control over the country was slipping from their hands, drawing it into the deep vice of siege and pressure. In those times, it seemed that the era of an independent, mighty Egypt was approaching its decline, and that all that remained were memories of past power. One of those who ascended the throne during the difficult period was a king named Komos, who took the Egyptian throne approximately 155 years before the new era. In his records and chronicles, he left a vivid testimony about the state of his people and country. Speaking of the inhuman and unbearable situation in which Egypt found itself, I would like to understand what forces I possess. When in my land the leaders first gather, one of them is in Araris, and the other in Cush. He wrote about his heavy experiences, with hope and despair at the same time. I sit beside the Asiatic and the Nubian, each of whom holds a part of Egypt in their hands. I cannot pass by them to Memphis. No one can remain calm when their state is ravaged by exorbitant taxes from the Asiatics. Deep in his soul, the king dreamed of rising up against them, to destroy their power and save his native land, for his heart was filled with the determination to defeat the invaders. Perhaps Komos had a very personal, even irreconcilable confrontation with the Hyksos. Archaeological findings attest to this. The mummies of the previous pharaoh, his father, show that he suffered serious head wounds, likely in battle. Modern studies indicate that these wounds were inflicted by a heavy-bladed weapon, and most likely the pharaoh's head was sliced around the cheek area, with the jaw and skull broken. It is quite probable that he fell under the blows of enemies on the battlefield. The ruler's body was urgently returned to the old city of Thebes, where it was quickly prepared for mummification. In light of recent findings, the question arises, who could have inflicted such severe wounds and for what purpose, and how did his body end up? What was the cause of this intimidating state? One can only guess that the anger of the prince-king was uncontrollable, that despite the fears of the courtiers, the inner rage and hatred towards the invaders, the Hyksos who had settled in the northern part of the country, boiled in his heart. According to historians, many courtiers feared the outbreak of a full-scale war, as it could further destroy the country and exacerbate the complicated political situation. At that time, an ancient manuscript known as the Carnarvon Tablet was preserved, which tells how the Egyptians appealed to their king with a request to maintain peace and avoid new conflicts. They said, "We are peaceful in our part of Egypt, Aswan at the first cataract is strong, and the central part of the country is under our control. The men here cultivate the best lands, and our grazing pastures on the papyrus swamps allow us to live and grow. We send grain for our pigs, and the livestock is never touched." These words emphasized that the Egyptians guarded their land and were only ready to defend their borders in case of an attack. But Komos refused to follow their advice. He wanted to strike the Hyksos but understood that first it was necessary to strengthen the southern border of the country and recapture the old fortress of Buin, located before the second cataract of the Nile. An important strategic point, the fortress of Buin was one of those rare defensive structures built by the Egyptians from stone rather than from sun-dried brick. For a long time, it served as a reliable stronghold, but after the fall of the Middle Kingdom, its garrison entered the service of the Nubian rulers who ruled the kingdom of Kush. The return of T. His fortress became one of the priority points in the plans to protect the southern borders to give Egypt the strength and opportunity to resist the Hyksos and strengthen the defense of the entire southern part of the kingdom. When Komos sought to hold the southern borders of Egypt while simultaneously fighting the Hyksos in the north of the country, he had to resort to decisive measures. One of the most important tasks in his strategic The plan was to regain control over the fortress of Buin, a key point guarding Egypt's southern borders. Koma, having received the order to defend it, moved south, preparing for a siege and possible assault. However, likely having noticed in the distance a large and powerful Egyptian army slowly approaching, the fortress's inhabitants, clearly understanding that their chances of victory were slim, made the decision to swear allegiance to the pharaoh and surrender the fort without a fight. As a result, this strategically important position was no longer in enemy hands, and now, controlling the south, the Egyptian forces could focus on other matters. Meanwhile, when this stronghold was already under Egyptian control, Komos returned to the city of Fishel to prepare for the next season of military campaigns. His goal was clear, to launch a new campaign against the Hyksos to reunite the fragmented Egypt under the rule of a single lord. In these years, during the third year of his reign, he began implementing his plans. In his notes he wrote, "I went north with my army and fighting forces to confront the Asiatics. I brought with me his brightness Ammon, and my brave army marched ahead of me like a flame, scorched by the passion for victory, with the best archers and fighters. When our fleet, fully armed, approached the Hyksos, it suddenly attacked them at the most unexpected moment. The fortunate surprise attack caught the enemy off guard, and the foreigners, caught unawares, suffered a crushing defeat. Komos's vengeance was cruel and full of fury. On one of those days when the sun was just rising over the horizon, I attacked their fortifications like a bright luminary, dispersing the clouds of enemy defense. At breakfast time it was destroyed, its walls were bombarded, and its people slain and defeated. Komos forced his wife to descend to the riverbank and there forcibly accept the authority of the Egyptian forces. His army acted fiercely, like lions hunting their prey, capturing livestock, wealth, and honey. They divided the trophies and possessions, rejoicing in their victory and wealth. At the same time, I completely devastated the cities on the two rivers, leaving behind only piles of ruins, scorched by fire and destruction. These cities were burned to the ground, their houses turned into heaps of glowing ashes, forever immortalized in history as places destroyed by our onslaught. Those who disobeyed the orders of the Asian army and did not recognize the authority of Komos hastily fled Egypt, leaving their masters in despair. The king of the Hyksos, seeing obvious signs of defeat, immediately sought help from his ally, the king of Kush, the ruler of the Nubian lands. At 1 hour, the Egyptians intercepted a secret message sent to the southern lands. They recorded its contents, and it quickly became clear what Egypt was planning against us. The document said, "The ruler there, in Egypt, Comus, invades my territory, though I have never attacked him or caused harm to you. He chose these two countries to strike at me and you, ravaging our lands. You should advance north without retreat so that we can divide the cities of Egypt and stop him as best we can." When this messenger returned to the king of the Hyksos and tried to deliver the message, he was shocked and could not bring himself to speak it to his master. He likely realized that all was lost, and there was no hope for salvation. Soon the war ended, and the victorious return of Comus, possibly with some exaggeration, was greeted as a triumph. He spoke of his heroic return to Thebes as a momentous event. "It was a joyful return home for the ruler," he wrote. "Life, prosperity, happiness followed us, for our army had not suffered a single defeat, and no comrade was harmed in battle. Our hearts were full of joy, no one wept. I returned to my native lands during the flood season, when the rivers overflow their banks, filling everything around with fresh water. The river bank seemed to shine under the sun's rays, and Thebes in. I was greeted like a hero with a celebration. Women and men gathered in my square, greeting and embracing each other with genuine joy. Every woman suddenly found the strength to hug her neighbor, showing gratitude and all supportive warmth. At that moment, no one was crying, everyone was full of happiness and hope for the future. My son, Yamas, did not miss the chance, and during an even larger campaign, he captured the ancient capital of Memphis, known as the center of great temples and monuments. He became the first pharaoh in the last 100 years to restore lost glory and bring under his rule the great pyramids of Giza. One can only roughly imagine the feelings that overwhelmed him when he looked upon these majestic monuments of his ancestors, Khufu and Khafre, erected over 1,000 years ago. This moving scene inspired him to new achievements. He decided to build his own pyramid in Upper Egypt on the site of the abandoned city of Abydos, to immortalize his memory and leave behind a legacy worthy of the great rulers of past eras. This pyramid became one of the first erected in Egypt after the fall of the Middle Kingdom. It was clearly conceived as a symbol of the revival of the great empire, its rich heritage, and the powerful cultural tradition that the ancient Egyptians valued for centuries. However, despite its significance as a landmark monument, this pyramid also turned out to be the last one built by an Egyptian ruler in the form of such grand tombs. After Yamas captured the Nile Delta, he moved north, passing through the Sinai Peninsula and coming to the traditional territory of the Hyksos people, a group foreign to the Egyptians and inhabiting the north, in Palestine. In the era of the New Kingdom, Egypt experienced its heyday, reaching heights of power and glory that seemed unattainable during the most difficult years of crisis. Its borders expanded far to the south, beyond the Second Cataract of the Nile, into the area of modern northern Sudan, reaching the island of Sai, located on the borders of the present-day territories of Sudan. For 3 centuries during the New Kingdom era, the state reached its maximum territorial extent, erecting numerous magnificent temple complexes and monuments that still astonish with their scale and craftsmanship. Although Memphis continued to serve as the capital, the Egyptians already felt the need to choose new centers of power. They settled in Hem, the city of Thebes, located far upstream along the Nile in Upper Egypt. By that time, Egypt had successfully adopted from its enemies, the Hyksos people, the chariot technology, the secret of speed and mobility, which the Egyptian army actively used in military campaigns. Now the empire's armed forces had powerful detachments of these light, fast, and maneuverable war machines, delivering death and destruction to their enemies. For several centuries, Egypt witnessed the reign of its first female pharaoh, the great pharaoh Hatshepsut, one of the most influential and talented women of her time. Under her leadership, impressive architectural monuments such as the temple complexes at Karnak grew, as well as the famous mortuary temple known as the Holy of Holies, a place where goddesses and pharaohs were venerated. Furthermore, Hatshepsut organized a sea voyage on 5 ships to the mysterious land of Punt, located somewhere deep in Africa. Upon returning, she brought back amazing goods, fragrant trees, rare tan, woods, aromatic trees with rich green scents, ebony, ivory, and gold, all of which became a true sensation at the dawn of a new era. What was especially impressive was that in her inscriptions, she enthusiastically wrote about the wonders her expedition brought back. There she described fabulous forests full of incense and aromatic trees, as well as many rare and valuable goods. The most striking were the rare treasures that had never before been delivered to Egypt: panther skins, marvelous rewards of the journey, Prevost descending in value all that they had before. But despite his great achievements and successes, the era of the New Kingdom was not without dramatic events within the royal court, sometimes even with elements of tragedy. At the center of these events is the story of one of the Egyptian pharaohs, who attracted special attention from historians and chroniclers. He was called a revolutionary, a ruler who changed the order, or even a madman. His name was Amenhotep Cairo, and he ascended the Egyptian throne around the 35th century BCE, inheriting the name of his father, known as Amenhotep in Terra. Like many Egyptian names, his name included the name of the god Ammonius, which literally meant, Ammonius is pleased, expressing the blessing and favor of the deity. Ammonius had long been a revered god of the city of Thebes, the god of fertility, wind, and life. However, after the expulsion of the Hyksos and the restoration of Thebes as the capital city of the state, the image and significance of this god changed. Ammonius was united with the sun god Ra, creating a new deity Ammonius Ra, a symbol of the strength and power of a united Egypt, its unifying force and the spiritual support of the new era. In Egyptian mythology, Ammonius was depicted as a majestic god with a mystical golden staff in his hand and a crown rising above his head, a symbol of his power and status. Subsequently, his image underwent significant changes. He began to be depicted with a blue skin tone, symbolizing the universal power and mysterious depth of his character. This god gradually rose to the top of the pantheon Egyptian theology, becoming not only one of the main gods but also a kind of king of all deities, the creator of all existence. One of the well-known hymns in honor of Ammonius Ra so emphasizes his omnipotence and primacy that it sounds like a proclamation of his dominion in the cosmos: Lord of truth, Father of all gods, Creator of the human race, Maker of all animals, Lord of all that exists, Creator of the staff of life. During the first 4 years of the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep I, Torba, he preserved his name without changes, showing his commitment to traditions and old deities. But already around the 5th year of his reign, he made a decision about a radical change. He decisively changed his royal name, which meant he wanted to embody new ideas, replace old religious views with modern ones, and spread them throughout Egypt. This measure was driven by his desire to put an end to religious disunity created by numerous cultic differences widespread in various cities, temples, and religious practices of Egypt. As part of his religious reform, Amenhotep IV created a new cult, which focused not on the worship of a specific deity, but on the worship of the sun itself, the source of life and light. Every morning, at sunrise, the Egyptians began to see the sun as their new spiritual father, and it was depicted as a naked disk, brightly shining in the sky, a symbol of infinite energy and life force. The name of this divine disk was Aten, which in Egyptian meant disk. In one of the preserved hymns in honor of Aten, possibly composed by the pharaoh himself, admiration is expressed for his greatness, strength, and omnipotence. There is one God, of whom there is no other like you. You created the world according to your will. You are in my heart, and I know no other who knows you. Every day at your rising, the earth trembles in his fee. D with reverent awe. Around the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep decided to radically rename his royal name, expressing in it his faith and devotion to the new god Aten. Thus was born the name Akhenaten, which became a symbol of the emerging new religion and a testimony that he became the first person in history to proclaim monotheism. Within its framework, only Aten could be worshipped, excluding any veneration of previous gods. Temples dedicated to Ammonius were closed by the pharaoh's order, and all mention of him was destroyed, erasing his name from walls and stone inscriptions. The 7th himself. The leader ordered his servants and warriors to be sent throughout the state to destroy and annihilate all monuments associated with Ammon. In particular, they were sent so far that on the top of the majestic pyramid of Pharaoh Sneferu, they carved out the name of Ammon from the very top stone, trying to eradicate every reminder of the former religion. Such a radical step in religious practice was likely perceived by the Egyptians, accustomed to numerous gods and prayers, with surprise and even apprehension. Many might have feared the loss of their familiar beliefs, the abandonment of polytheism, and the acceptance of a new, still unclear concept. But the word of the pharaoh became the final law for everyone, and the majority simply submitted to the new rules. At first, Akhenaten transformed the old cult complexes, turning them into temples of Aten, which meant transforming long-established cults. He even planned to build new sanctuaries dedicated exclusively to the new god. However, over time, he realized that changing traditions formed over centuries was not easy and required much more time. The ancient temples, decorated with hundreds of years of hieroglyphic images glorifying other gods, as well as numerous relics with the history of centuries-old cults, could not be radically eliminated overnight. Thebes, being an ancient center of worship and a noble city, was also a stronghold of a powerful class of priests who actively resisted his reforms. For them, these changes posed a threat to their status, wealth, and traditions, with which their powerful influence was associated. In response to the situation, Akhenaten made a bold and unpredictable decision. He decided to found a city on entirely new land, which was to become his legacy and a symbol of a new era. This land was located in a deserted and barren area between the ancient cities of Memphis and Thebes, where the landscape was almost devoid of any signs of life: vast plains, lifeless expanses, and a flat, smooth surface. Lands. In this silent space, where nature itself seemed to have surrendered to his design, Akhenaten addressed his courtiers, expressing his desire to build a city destined to become a new center of culture and power. He wished for a monument to be erected in his honor, one that would forever bear a name symbolizing his kingdom and faith. This desire was not only ambitious but also filled with deep symbolism. He wanted to create a place where his name and the idea of eternity would be immortalized for centuries. The wise counsel came from his father. He emphasized the importance of creating a monument that would not disappear with time but would be an eternal testament to his deeds. Akhenaten realized that no official, no one in his country before, had given him such advice. He was faced with an ambitious task: to raise a city that would become home to the divine Aten and his followers. The plan was as follows: in this new settlement, there were to be palaces for the king himself and his chief wife Nefertiti, as well as for 4 other wives, spacious gardens, burial tombs, administrative buildings, workshops, and, most importantly, a huge temple dedicated to Aten. The time required to build this new city was considerable: more than 8 years of diligent work, days and nights spent on construction and beautification. When this long-awaited building was completed, in the 12th year of His Majesty Akhenaten's reign, a solemn hour of celebration arrived. This event took place in the 22nd century BC and became a vivid testament to the glory of the new capital. On this day, the city was filled with a special festive atmosphere. Delegations gathered from across the region. Ambassadors and representatives of peoples from the Near East, from the Hittites of Syria, the Mediterranean islands such as Cyprus and Crete to the lands of Nubia, Punt, and Kush in the south, arrived to witness the grandeur of the new city and to confirm the achievements of an empire that was rapidly advancing. Guests and their accompanying delegations were struck by the grandeur and beauty of this place. Quiet grumblings of priests and worried whispers of common folk could be heard, for changes and innovations often evoke conflicting emotions. Nevertheless, the festival took place. The ceremony was grand in scale: solemn processions, lavish decorations, music and dancing, the inhalation of incense aromas, and the most exquisite delicacies created an atmosphere of a true celebration. Representatives of foreign lands and hedonists from all around admired the chants and hymns dedicated to the new deity Aten, clad in majesty and light. Majestic speeches and the solemn parade underscored this ceremony as a significant event of the era. The god Aten created the world by his will. He gave life to all people, livestock, and wild beasts. His greatness encompasses everything: all that moves upon the earth and flies in the sky, all that stretches out on the horizon. He placed every person in their proper place, caring that all satisfy their needs and desires. The peoples of Syria and Nubia, the land of Egypt, all felt a living connection with this new god, and each sincerely believed that their fate and well-being depended on Aten's favor. Each nation, despite differences in language and character, had its own traditional dishes, customs, and lifespans. Everyone felt a special blessing and hope on this great day, awaiting positive changes. However, despite all the triumphs and splendor of the celebration, the consequences of this festival turned out to be terrifying. The plague, which had already been spreading across the Near East for some time, suddenly reached threatening proportions. It struck the lands of Syria and the Hittite Empire, located in present-day Turkey, becoming a true time bomb. At the same time, the first prayers of the Hittites were created appeals to the gods, in which people begged for relief from the deadly scourge. For already 20 years people had been dying, struck down by this terrible disease, and it seemed that deliverance was not in sight. These questions arose: could this plague remain forever on their lands? Could the evil that had tormented them for centuries never be driven out? In every heart, anxiety flared ever stronger. The hopelessness of those years was felt more clearly than ever, when death mowed down more and more lives, and no one could understand how to stop this terrible calamity. In the year when Egypt was engulfed by this terrible scourge, a deadly virus arrived in its rich and multifaceted country, with an abundance of unique scrolls and a numerous slave troop, taking silent death to countless lives. It began to spread throughout the upper and lower reaches of the Nile, stealing lives and destroying the foundations of prosperity. And if in Akhenaten's heart there was hope that the celebration would strengthen the people's faith in the new god and bring spiritual renewal, alas, the consequences turned out to be much heavier and more dramatic. This pandemic became an all-pervading force, destroying everything in its path. Not a single family remained untouched. The losses touched his closest circle, taking the lives of his mother, wife, and 3 daughters, leaving deep wounds in the heart of the ruler and the entire state. F1 considers the situation with the events even inside the relatively protected palace of royal power. It can be confidently said that on a much larger scale and much more destructively, such catastrophic shocks would have impacted the entire people of the country. For the people of Egypt, this terrible misfortune evidently became not just a trial, but a true severe test of faith, resilience, and survival. Not so long ago, just about 33 centuries before our era, after a long reign lasting 17 years, Akhenaten, who was one of the most famous and revered pharaohs of the Amarna period, passed away. Attempting to preserve the ancient cult and traditions of his ancestor, some members of his family made attempts to revive the cult of Aten in the new capital Wahitado, a small town that was soon devastated by a terrible plague. Over the next 4 years, his relatives held power one after another, but their efforts apparently not only failed to bring success but also led to the situation in the empire becoming increasingly unstable and hopeless. It seemed the entire country was on the brink of complete destruction and collapse. At such a critical moment, one of Akhenaten's sons ascended the throne, a boy only 8 years old. His father gave him a name filled with hope and faith, Tutankhaten, meaning living image of Aten, and hoped that this child would continue his family's work in the faith they followed. However, the boy did not rule under this name for long. Already a few years later, in the 3rd year of his reign, he turned away from the new religion imposed by his father, which was supported throughout the empire, and decided to change his name to mark the beginning of a new stage in his life. Now he became known by a name associated not with Aten but with the ancient god Ammonius, whose cult had long been an established and important part of the Egyptian religious system. The people of Egypt gladly and enthusiastically embraced the return to traditional beliefs and cults, and the name Tutankhamun became a symbol of this return, the restoration of ancient gods and rituals. The change of the young king's name was itself an eloquent signal that he decisively rejected many of the reforms carried out by his father. He ceased worship of Aten and restored the veneration of Ammonius, a god who played a central role in the religion of Egypt, especially in the city of Thebes. Tutankhamun lifted the bans on the cults of many gods, firmly believing that a return to tradition would help strengthen the state and bring stability. As a result, many temples dedicated to Aten, located in Thebes and other cities, were destroyed or seriously damaged, and bricks decorated with hieroglyphs and images of these deities were often used in the construction of new cult buildings and temples. It seemed that society fully accepted the changes that had taken place, and the majority. Your Egyptians preferred to forget the difficult times associated with the era of Akhenaten and his innovations. Today, the young pharaoh Tutankhamun is considered perhaps the most famous of all Egyptian rulers. His name is known far more widely than such great kings as Khufu and Khafre, as well as the renowned creators of the first pyramids, Djoser and Sneferu. Also, he is surpassed in popularity and recognition by great statesmen such as Kamose and Ahmose, who freed Egypt from internal political strife, united the country, and expelled the Hyksos. Even his father, Akhenaten, and the great queen Nefertiti, despite their significance, are less famous than the young ruler. In the history of ancient Egypt, few rulers reached such a level of fame and recognition as Queen Hatshepsut or the boy king Tutankhamun. However, despite such popularity, there was nothing in Tutankhamun's reign that could explain or justify his extraordinary fame. He died at a very young age, only 9 years old, after a short reign that lasted just 9 years. This kind and beloved by the people king, it is believed, was able to return Egypt to the right path and lead it out of the chaos and strife caused by his father's disorderly rule. The real reason for his fame, however, lies not so much in his achievements or reformist actions as in chance. When he died in 1320 BCE, he was buried in a tomb located in the famous Valley of the Kings, a place considered the burial ground of the country's great rulers. This tomb, although not as luxurious and magnificent as the pyramids of the ancient era, the pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, or Menkaure, nevertheless served as a worthy final resting place for the young king. However, shortly after it was sealed, an extraordinary and completely unforeseen event took place. A strong flood suddenly penetrated this part of the necropolis. The doors of the tomb were blocked by sand and stones, which made the entrance completely invisible to her. This event played an important role in the history of this ruler, precisely because the burial remained hidden and inaccessible to outsiders. The tomb preserved its secret and uniqueness, becoming one of the most valued archaeological monuments and testimonies of ancient Egyptian culture. For more than 3,300 years, the Valley of the Kings remained the arena of endless attacks by robbers and plundering, showing no mercy to either time or the efforts of individual monarchs. Almost all the tombs of great pharaohs were mercilessly plundered, their treasures and burial artifacts ruthlessly taken away, and the mummies entirely stolen or destroyed. However, at one astonishing moment, thanks to a coincidence of circumstances and luck, Tutankhamun's tomb remained out of reach for thieves. At that time, one had to observe how other precious aristocratic burials were plundered, jewels disappeared, mummies were taken, and luxurious adornments were ravaged. The tomb, hidden beneath layers of sand and sand dunes, seemed to have protected itself securely, preserving its integrity and wealth to this day. This unique fact caused its discovery only in the 22nd year of the 20th century, when the famous Egyptologist Howard Carter managed to locate its secret entrance and make a sensational discovery. So many artifacts were extracted from the inner tomb heritage that the entire world community was filled with admiration and amazement. Especially outstanding from the entire collection was the famous golden burial mask of Tutankhamun, probably the most famous monument of the ancient world and the embodiment of the grandeur, wealth, and power of the Egyptian monarchy. This mask is a magnificent decoration made of pure gold, capable of impressing with its sophistication and craftsmanship. What is surprising is that it looks at us like a portrait of a boy who was entrusted with rulership during difficult, turbulent times, appearing before us as if a living picture of a story of the past. In modern understanding, it is hard to believe that this very mask, made of gold, is the image of the young pharaoh who was to govern the country in an era of change. The time when the Egyptian state, through its descendants, reached approximately 50 years after the reign of Tutankhamun, giving way to perhaps the greatest of Egyptian rulers, Ramses II, known in history as Ramses the Great. This king ascended the throne at the age of 14, which occurred in 1279 BC. At that time, the Mediterranean coast of Egypt was going through a difficult period of devastation and chaos, as the country was engulfed in internal conflicts and external threats. Ramses II devoted much of his long and righteous life to combating pirate raids and attacks from sea bandits. However, his most significant achievement was the expansion of the Egyptian state's borders to the north, moving toward Syria. At that time, a powerful empire emerged in the mountains of modern Turkey, steadily strengthening its position and expanding its influence throughout the Middle East. Its distinction lay in strong organization and developed military tactics. The main pillar of this empire was the mountain Hittite state, centered in the fortified city of Hattusa. From the outside, the Hittites seemed to be a relatively new power on the regional stage, yet their domains were vast and rich, and their territory quite fertile and resource-abundant. They not only developed new military methods but also transformed chariots, traditionally used for transportation, into heavy combat vehicles capable of delivering powerful blows to the enemy. For the last 2 centuries, Egypt had been engaged in increasingly fierce wars with the Hittites for control of the strategically important region of Palestine. In the 4th year of his reign, King Ramses II assembled a powerful expedition, a military formation that heading through the hot and lifeless Sinai Desert, the army moved northward. In the description of the campaign, created as a poetic text, the strength of the army brought by the great king was admiringly portrayed. It was said that His Majesty embarked on the campaign to the north accompanied by numerous infantry units and chariot battalions, following the established routes leading through wastelands and steppes. Every country he encountered on his path felt fear and awe before the power of his forces. Their rulers brought gifts, and the rebels obeyed and submitted to his will, recognizing the king's strength. The main goal of this campaign was the conquest of the city Caspian Kadesh, a strong fortress standing on the sandy banks of the Orontes River. This city had for many years played the role of a kind of provocateur and strategic player, forging alliances now with the Hittites, now with the Egyptians, which made it an especially valuable and dangerous neighbor. Therefore, King Ramses was determined to finally establish Egypt's rule over Kadesh and make it part of his empire. In his campaign plans, he led 4 divisions, each named after ancient gods Ammonius, Are, Set, and Ta. His army included thousands of chariots and elite horsemen, whom he ordered to be landed on the coast to become part of the offensive forces. These units were to travel by sea deep into the country to meet the king upon his arrival in Kadesh and ensure a brilliant and final conquest of this important city. Initially, everything went smoothly and successfully. During their reconnaissance missions, Egyptian scouts in the service of the pharaoh captured 2 representatives of the Shesa tribe, who managed to bring important news. The Hittite king was increasingly retreating northward, fearing the power and influence of Egypt, which threatened his territories. These messengers also reported that the Hittites had left a strategic position unprotected, the city of Kadesh. Ramses heard this news with enthusiasm, because did not inspire hope for success in the upcoming campaign. Inspired by this news, he decided not to hesitate and hasten north to capture Kadesh, using only one of his 4 divisions of the proud troops of Ammonius. He believed this would be enough to achieve victory. But soon a fatal mistake arose on his path. He did not calculate and did not suspect that the representatives of the Shesa tribe were not just simple envoys, but Hittite spy agents sent specifically to lure the Egyptians into a trap. When the Egyptians reached the camp and set up their camp near a rocky stream, their scouts went around to explore the area and look for possible threats. During their observations, some of them came across a couple of Hittite warriors hiding in dense undergrowth and carefully watching them. Soon a plausible skirmish broke out between them with the help of arrows, javelins, and accurate shots, as a result of which the Egyptians managed to capture one of the enemies. Perhaps after a harsh and thorough interrogation, the prisoner revealed important details. He said that the entire might of the Hittite army was hidden in the immediate vicinity of their camp, gathered and prepared for a sudden attack. Huge troops, formed in an ambush, were hiding behind the walls of the Kadesh fortress, which gave its name to this entire operation. In this description, the impressive power of the Hittites is clearly traced, which is extensively described in the so-called Epic of Kadesh. It seemed that the Hittites had fully concentrated their forces and prepared for the decisive offensive. They had gathered all their foreign troops, up to the very edge of the sea, occupying vast lands in their domains. Their armies filled the mountain ranges and valleys of the country, driven by a single goal: to defeat Egypt. They plundered the wealth of their lands, leaving no gold or silver, and the looted valuables were given to other peoples so that they would carry them into the upcoming battles. As bitter as it was for of the Egyptians, Ramses was filled with rage at his generals for allowing such a situation, for he felt trapped. In despair, he decided to move forward with his detachment, joining forces with Ammonius' troops, because he understood that at the critical moment his reinforcements had not yet arrived. The Hittites were not going to wait. Their tactics did not even give the Egyptians time to reload and regroup. When the Egyptian unit was only just supposed to arrive at the location, a terrible force burst out of an ambush, approximately 2,500 Hittite chariots. The swift and brutal attack swept over the flat part of the river valley. At that time, chariots represented a formidable and deadly weapon. Heavy armored platforms on which their riders, clad in chain mail down to their feet, used movement and power to clear a path through their enemies. Crashing into the Egyptian troops, they shattered their ranks, and the bewildered warriors, hoping to create a defensive wall of shields, found themselves defenseless against the enemy's might. The clash was swift and fierce. The Hittites scattered the Egyptian defenders, surrounded their camp, and pierced it with charges. Ramses found himself surrounded, completely cut off from reinforcements and heavily outnumbered by the enemy. Despite the desperate situation, he did not lose his composure. He gathered his warriors, raised their fighting spirit, and, as if it were the last battle on earth, led them in a decisive attack against the enemy. In the pharaoh's own account, he says that before his eyes were about 2,500 chariots, exactly the number under his control, and he saw how these heavy war machines turned into piles of enemy bodies lying at his horse's feet. He recalls that in those moments his heart was muffled by a sensation that all his troops had frozen in fear and were paralyzed, their hands trembled, and their eyes could not summon the strength to shoot. They could not release a dart or raise a weapon because they were filled with terror and sudden weakness. However, after that moment, the situation began to change. The Egyptian warriors, although they were the elite, yet they still began to resist, and their morale was possibly higher than that of many Hittites, some of whom might have been mercenaries or just recently trained. After the Egyptian detachment was practically destroyed and the chariots broke into the camp and frightened the enemies, many Hittite soldiers, confident in complete victory and believing the battle was already over, began looting. They recklessly engaged in pillaging the camp, even though their advantage was not yet fully secured. Thus, in the midst of fierce combat, a military storm and chaos, many of them, sensing victory, immediately ceased fighting and started robbing and looting. Shortly after the intense clashes with the Egyptian army in the south, new reinforcements arrived, sent from beyond Egypt. This fresh influx of forces gave the Egyptian warriors renewed determination and strengthened the command's confidence. As the sun gently tilted westward, at the height of the bloody battles, an elite detachment appeared on the horizon, a military unit distinguished by high training and skill moving along the coast. This was no longer just another detachment but a real strike force approaching the battlefield. Their arrival instilled in the Egyptians a sense of unshakable confidence and bolstered their resolve to continue the fight. For the Hittites, it was a heavy blow that broke their fighting spirit and undermined hopes for victory. Alexander the Great, seemingly continuing the line of great commanders, vividly and colorfully describes the subsequent events revealed in his chronicles. He recounts how, during the battle, I, commanding the Egyptian army, forced the enemy into a watery trap, plunging them into the river as suddenly and impressively as a crocodile attacks its prey. In this clash, the enemies fell onto each other, face forward, yielding to the power of my weapon, and I personally eliminated those who hindered me, those whose destruction was necessary to achieve the objectives. In this chaos, none of them end. No one could turn away to escape fate, no one could turn and save themselves. The fallen enemy, face down, had no chance to rise and continue the fight. As a result, the Hittite army began to retreat, and many of their warriors were thrown into the Orontes River, which bore witness to this bloodshed. At dawn the next day, both opposing sides met again in a fierce clash, exhausted after several days of continuous battles full of destruction and losses. However, both sides were already at the limit of their strength, their forces were significantly depleted. After several hours of prolonged fighting, I, General Ramses, was forced to retreat. The situation had become critical for me. In response, the king of the Hittites, noticing the weakening of the Egyptians, offered a truce and peace agreement. But I could not accept it. Our troops lacked the necessary siege equipment to take the firmly standing walls of the city of Kadesh. The only way to capture this fortified city would have been a long, difficult siege during which our forces would be vulnerable, poorly supplied, and exposed to enemy encirclement. Therefore, I decided to declare my victory and abandon attempts to storm the city. We turned back to Egypt, considering it a victory and tactfully preserving our honor. The Hittites, in turn, had to proclaim their victory, and the city of Kadesh remained under their control. Despite the glorious praises with which I was honored in a poem titled Akadesh, and our triumphant image, the battle ended without a decisive result. The final question of Kadesh's fate remained open. However, I proudly recalled my role in this battle and adorned the walls of the temple at Abu Simbel with magnificent bas-reliefs reflecting all stages of the battle, as if confirming my victorious merits. The war with the Hittites continued for another 15 long years, during which the Egyptians repeatedly captured the coastal lands located along the Mediterranean coast. However, each subsequent year brought opposite results. These territories once again came under the control of the Hittites. Gradually, both sides began to realize that fatigue and exhaustion made the grueling conflict unrealistic and pointless. And finally, the war reached its logical conclusion. A unique and important event appeared in history, the first documented, officially witnessed peace treaty that has survived to this day. Hattusili, the ruler of the Hittite kingdoms, concluded a treaty with Ramesses, the majestic Egyptian pharaoh, in which the terms of eternal peace and brotherly alliance were established. This peace was founded on mutual respect and trust, and from that time on, both sides promised to adhere to the agreement. Official copies of this treaty were prepared in 2 languages, in hieroglyphs, used by the Egyptians, and in Hittite cuneiform, so that each party could have its own copy. The document was carefully drafted, with slight differences in wording that highlighted the nuances of diplomatic maneuvering. The Egyptian version states that it was the Hittites who asked for peace, and the Egyptians nobly and gladly agreed to it. At the same time, the Hittite version claims that the initiative was taken by the Egyptians, who wished to end the bloodshed. Thus, both sides were able to save face and ensure a formal victory for each participant, preventing a destructive outcome to the conflict that could have lasted many more years. Conflicts that lasted nearly an entire century finally subsided, and the lands of Egypt saw a long-awaited, albeit relative, peace. Pride in the victories won in battle still remained within the country's walls, but it was this very peace treaty that went down in history forever. Its copy still proudly adorns the walls of the main administrative building of the United Nations in New York, reminding the entire world of this diplomatic success. The very name of Ramesses, who was considered the chief architect of this agreement, symbolizes his achievements not only in military clashes but also in creating an enduring legacy. Subsequently, it is regarded as. It appears that he honorably escaped death in the Battle of Kadesh by focusing on the construction of grand monuments and temples throughout the Egyptian land. During the next decade of his reign, he devoted all his efforts to building monumental structures meant to immortalize his name. Today, most of the surviving monuments from the pharaonic era bear the carved names from his reign. This was made possible not only because of his fruitful activity in erecting architectural masterpieces but also because he ensured that his memory was engraved so deeply in stone that even the unchanging winds of time could not erase its traces over centuries. Ramses II ruled Egypt for a full 66 years, continuous and fruitful, and entered history as possibly the most majestic and celebrated pharaoh. His full ancient Egyptian name was Usermater-Seti-Penra-Ramses, which can be interpreted as Eternal Son, strong in his dominion, Ramses. The Greeks later adapted his name to make it easier to pronounce as Amandias, the great ruler of ancient Egypt. Much has been written and told about this monarch's life, and many years later, the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, having visited Egypt, left a description of a monument of this mighty king. In front of the entrance to one of his grand sealed monuments rises a stone pylon made from multicolored stone blocks. Its width is approximately 2 cubits, and its height reaches 45 cubits. The inscription engraved on the pylon reads, "I am the King of Kings, Ozymandias. If anyone wishes to know my glory and the place of my rest, let him surpass at least one of my works." Ramses did not limit himself to building monuments, he also created a new capital, which was to become the center of his power and authority. Given his military aspirations directed northward, he chose a site on the northeastern shore of the Nile Delta. According to his character. By his tradition, he named the city after himself Per-Ramses, which meant House of Ramses. This new city was erected as a symbol of Egyptian power and great planning. Poetic lines celebrate the beauty and wealth of this settlement, praising its flourishing fields filled with fruits and stores for many days of prosperity. The capital's halls regularly store grain in abundance, barley and wheat as if scattered across the heavens. In the street canals and waterways splashes of red fish, veg, feed on lotus flowers, while luxurious dates, melons, and other gifts of nature spill onto the shores, their wealth rivaled only by abundance. In this city, everything is permeated with fertility, meadows, fields, and gardens, all creating an atmosphere of well-being and tranquility. The connection with ANC. And history is traced in that the city of Per-Ramses is often mentioned in relation to the biblical story of the people of Hebrew slaves who labored on construction works during the building of this very city. The second book of the Holy Scripture, Exodus, tells how the Hebrews were forced into hard labor in Egypt and how, ultimately, they were freed. However, for many years historians puzzled over the truthfulness of this story, considering it part of ancient literature rich in images and metaphors. To this day, there is no convincing archaeological evidence that a large population of Hebrew slaves ever lived in Egypt or that their labor was a key factor in the construction of Per-Ramses. It is more likely that the city was built with the help of professional Egyptian craftsmen and seasonal workers attracted for such large-scale projects. However, given the proximity of the Nile Delta to the Levantine coast, it is quite possible that among the workers there were also Hebrew settlers or artisans who came to participate in the construction. Possibly, nomadic tribes moving through the Sinai Desert sought the south, to the Nile Valley, to trade with their labor and exchanging goods. If their journeys truly had such a purpose, then traces of their movements, unfortunately, have not been preserved in archaeological monuments and inscriptions left by their descendants. Nevertheless, these nomads undoubtedly left their enduring mark on our imagination and historical perception of ancient times. Ramses the Great passed away in the year 1212 BC, reaching, by the most approximate estimates, nearly 90 years of age. His long and brilliant reign was considered one of the most significant and outstanding periods in the history of Egypt, marked by great military victories, large-scale construction projects, and cultural prosperity. However, the extended duration of his reign led to a certain problem that many rulers of the ancient world suffered from: succession to the throne at an advanced age. At the time of Ramses the Almighty's 12th death, his elder sons were already of very respectable age or, unfortunately, had passed away. The last to ascend the throne after his death was his third eldest son, named Mer-Neptah. He was about 70 years old when he took the Egyptian throne. This age was certainly no longer young, and the power was passed to a man who had long since reached mature years. However, just a few years after the beginning of his long reign, Egypt suddenly faced a new threat, an enemy who threatened its western borders. This enemy was the Libyans, a population living beyond the Nile Delta, in the western part of the country. The king of the Libyans, named Mari, had apparently been preparing for the attack for a long time, gathering forces and strengthening his positions. And suddenly, a powerful army of Libyans struck Egypt, causing chaos and destruction. The Libyan troops crossed the country's northwestern border, and their numbers increased with reinforcements from various regions of the Mediterranean, among which were mentioned Greece, Sardinia, Sicily, and other lands located over the maritime space. This motley group of peoples, representatives of various cultures and languages, suddenly appeared on a large scale throughout the eastern Mediterranean. These peoples, distinguished by diverse customs and armaments, later became known as the Sea Peoples, united by a common threat and common goals. Pharaoh Mer-Neptah, the great ruler of Egypt, documented these events on one of the carved steels. In his descriptions, he speaks of the misfortune that befell the Libyan chieftain, named Merira, son of Ded, a man who, acting as a leader, attacked the land called Sheker with his archers, warlike units, the pride of his army. In his account, the names of the best warriors and commanders are mentioned, such as Shardana, Shikalesh, Akwesh, Luka, and Chairs, men who were chosen to fight and defend the country. Mer-Neptah gathered the best forces, brought his wife and children, as well as the leaders of the main camps, and reached the western borders of Egypt near the fields of Pereir. Despite the danger, the Egyptian king successfully repelled and thwarted the invasion. To restore order and prevent new attacks, he ordered the execution of many of the invaders who tried to break into Memphis, the main capital of the country. In his decrees, he proclaimed, "No one dares to raise their head among the 9 bows, the all-encompassing forces and instruments of war. The enemy, Sheker, will fall. Hutti, the land completely pacified. Canaan plundered, evil reigns everywhere. Hura has become a widow, all lands united, but this peace will not last long." The lands have again found temporary refuge and solitude. However, soon after the death of my ancestor, Pharaoh Mer-Neptah, around 1212 BCE, Egypt found itself in the whirlpool of civil wars and internal conflicts. Then began a period of civil unrest and struggle for power within the country, which continued for a long time and became one of the dark pages of Egyptian history. Internally, the contradictions had become so exacerbated that even the descendants of Ramses began a struggle to renumber the throne, and the heated passions did not subside, with the situation becoming increasingly unstable. At the same time, the region faced a series of catastrophic natural phenomena that caused widespread troubles and disasters. Particularly important in this process was the mysterious shift in climatic conditions and their impact on agriculture and the population. The causes of such changes remain a subject of scientific research and debate to this day. As already noted in the second episode about the collapse of the Bronze Age, one possible cause could have been a powerful volcanic eruption, an event that left traces in the geological record. Specifically, around this period, there was a major eruption of the Hekla volcano in Iceland, which caused significant climatic changes across Europe and beyond. There is also a hypothesis that an eruption on the island of Sicily around 1300 BCE played a role in worsening weather conditions. And although much remains a mystery from those times, scientists suggest that the activity of the supervolcano Thera on the island of Santorini, known for its destructive power, may have resumed roughly 500 years after its previous grand eruption. Besides volcanic activity, possible causes of these cataclysms include changes in solar activity, prolonged periods of a little ice age, or sharp climatic anomalies, especially in the Atlantic Ocean, leading to significant changes in weather patterns, causing droughts, reduced precipitation, and depriving the region of fertility. All this contributed to deep crises and the destruction of old civilizations, leaving marks on the history and geography of the ancient world. In those distant times we speak of today, the Earth's climate system remained extremely fragile, interconnected, and quite unpredictable. Even the slightest changes in this delicate balance could lead to very serious, and sometimes catastrophic, consequences. Throughout all this time since the Earth was covered with bright green expanses, they gradually turned into dry and barren lands. Where vegetation once thrived, plants adapted to arid conditions and constantly struggling for life began to appear. Scientific studies of core planting rocks and analysis of oxygen isotopes taken from cave mineral samples clearly show that in the 10th and 11th centuries BC, rainfall levels significantly decreased compared to previous eras. Numerous records of severe droughts can be found in the written sources of that region, confirming this scientific data. The great adversaries Egypt and the Hittite kingdom, located in their Rocky Mountains, also suffered from water shortages and worsening living conditions. From very ancient sources, some fragments have reached us, among which is a Hittite text known as the Myth of Telepainu. This text apparently reflects the spirit of that time and carries a poetic allegory similar to the myth of a disappearing god. The poem tells of a deity so insulted and disappointed by lawlessness and human vices that he fell into deep sorrow and refused to perform his duties. This deity's name is Telepainu. He is associated with the god of agriculture, fertility, and, to some extent, with weather. However, the beginning of this myth is lost, and we do not know what exactly caused Telepainu's wrath. Nevertheless, from the available lines of the poem, it can be understood that his departure led to terrible consequences. Windows remained covered with ash, the flame went out, smoke disappeared, and the fire that hung over people and nature vanished with its fury. Telepainu, overwhelmed with longing and despair, left his place. He took away all the harvest from the fields and meadows, then disappeared into the forest thicket, hiding in order to avoid prying eyes. Soon after that, the seeds stopped bearing fruit, and the most important animals in the household, bulls, sheep, and even people, ceased to reproduce. Gradually, the possibility of conceiving children disappeared. Those who dared to try to give birth could not fulfill their goal, to become parents. The slopes of the hills, once covered with greenery, were exposed and deserted. The trees ceased to sprout shoots, doomed to remain bare. Devastated pastures, dried up springs, all this led the country to famine and ruin. People and gods were on the brink of survival, struggling with malnutrition and disease. While the Egyptians may have perceived this phenomenon as the weakening of a strong rival, their material and cultural situation was not better, but still not as tragic. There is a document dated approximately to the 10th century BCE called the Lament for Ammonius. In this text, deep feelings of sorrow and despair are expressed, like a cry from dark ages, "Come to me, Father Ammonius, protect me in this bitter year of confrontation." That god, shining with light, froze and disappeared with his brightness. Winters are encroaching on summers, months go backward, time loses direction and floats by like a drunken creature. These words were spread through the poisoned air. They were uttered by shepherds in the fields and marshes, people collecting clothes on riverbanks, as well as locals abandoning their plots. In those days, in the heat of this difficult time, mixed with grief, horned beasts wandered the desert expanses, having lost their way in hope. After about 100 years of suffering and calamities, a military ruler named Sitnacht came to power in the country. He ruled for only 3 years, but, to great regret, died, and the throne passed to his young son, the last hope who might change the fate of the people. This boy had only one name, in honor of a great predecessor who ruled almost 100 years ago and participated in the Battle of Kadesh. Time will tell whether he will meet expectations, no more. Married to the boy, as the fate of the empire largely depended on his decisions and actions. Thus, this boy, named the heir and future ruler, striving in all things to imitate the legendary Pharaoh Ramses II, intended to conduct himself as a true military leader and statesman. The new king, like his great predecessor, showed exceptional determination and persistence, demonstrating that he was not afraid to take responsibility for the fate of the state. It was evident that he deeply admired the powerful personality of the ancient rulers and sincerely wished to emulate them to restore the former glory of Egypt. Not shying away from his ambitions, he even decided to name all his sons after the famous pharaoh Ramses II, hoping that they would continue his work and follow the ancestors' precepts. Moreover, he granted his heirs the same high positions as their forebear, wishing to most vividal. Why demonstrate his determination to return Egypt to the status of a great power, celebrated in all corners of the world? His words about striving to become like Ramses II so that his deeds and actions would glorify his name were heard and understood by all. In his inscriptions and addresses, he proclaimed, "I desire to reach the heights by which the great pharaoh Ramses II was glorified, and for my exploits to be spoken of by descendants." In ancient stone texts, he left the words, "O Egypt, rejoice, rise to the height of the heavens. I am the ruler of the south and the north, the Lord sitting on the throne of Adam. The gods chose me as king of Egypt to defeat the enemies and drive them out of the noble lands. They granted me the throne in childhood, and since then my reign has been full of abundance, glory, and victories." Perhaps, under different circumstances, in a more favorable situation, he could have become one of the greatest rulers of Egypt, whose name would have been spoken with respect for many centuries. However, fate decreed otherwise. Upon ascending the throne, he soon faced a series of serious conflicts and military trials that complicated his reign. One of the primary causes of these wars was the invasion of peoples known as the Sea Peoples, who first appeared in Egyptian history during the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah. These invaders, driven by a thirst for destruction and power, attacked neighboring lands with increasing strength and organization, likely receiving support or being spurred on by widespread crop failures in northern and western Europe, which led to famine and social tension in their homelands. In those years, trading cities such as the ports of Ugarit came under sudden attack from the sea enemies, and these assaults were so powerful and unexpected that many were destroyed so completely that they were never rebuilt and remained abandoned forever. At that time, the mighty and prosperous trading centers of the region located on the coast, such as Ugarit, were subjected to sudden sea raids, and the strength of these attacks led to their ultimate downfall. At the same time, Egypt's rivals, the Hittites, once powerful and dominant peoples in the Near East, were on the brink of extinction, as the trade routes connecting them with other regions fell into decline under the pressure of new threats. Ramses vividly remembered those harsh times when northern invaders landed on the coast, and the island inhabitants, falling under their control, were gripped by genuine terror and despair, fighting for their lives and freedom. No land, no matter how fertile or suited for resistance, could withstand their might. Hutti, Carchemish, Arvad, and Alalak, all these lands were devastated and destroyed. The invaders set up camp directly at sea, and their troops ruthlessly and mercilessly annihilated the local population, laying waste to the lands to the ground. When news of the large-scale attacks of the Sea Peoples reached Ramses, he was already an 8-year ruler of Egypt and had successfully repelled 2 attacks from Libya, strengthening his troops and expanding the army. However, news of the approach of even more. His organized and numerous enemies caused him anxiety and reflection. Soon he learned that the Sea Peoples' fleet was moving toward Egypt, and his plans for calm and stable rule were threatened. In his inscriptions carved on stones in the Medinet Habu temple, he described in detail how these enemies marched like burning fire and clearly showed that their ultimate goal was to conquer Egypt. Among the attackers were the tribes of Peleset, Jeker, Shikalesh, Denyen, and Weshish, united in a powerful alliance and expanding their domains to the borders of long-known and respected civilizations. Their hearts were full of confidence and determination to carry out their plans despite all obstacles. Realizing the full danger of the situation, Ramses understood that he had to apply the maximum of his strategic and military resources. He decided to take a defensive position at the mouths of the Nile, in the rich and fertile delta area, which was vital for the country. There, at this important strategic point, he intended to use all the capabilities of the Egyptian army to catch the sea enemies by surprise and prevent them from occupying key territories. He was ready for battle and so well armed that he could lure the enemy into a trap like a predatory bird skillfully stalking its prey in a snare. Ramses significantly strengthened his borders in the Zahia region and prepared to meet potential opponents. He convened a meeting of chiefs, infantry captains, and noblemen of the country to jointly develop and implement a plan of defense and protection against the looming threat. The harbor mouths, which were the most important gates of the water, were securely protected by powerful warships, galleys, barges, and other vessels designed to fight possible sieges. These ships were manned by brave warriors ready to steadfastly hold the defense. Among them were fighters from the various peoples of Egypt, each chosen for their exceptional courage and skill. They resembled lions roaring and growling atop the heights of elevations. Nasti, symbols of strength and wildness, ready at any moment to rush into battle. And their steeds, trembling with excitement and anticipation of the fight, were full of energy, striving to mercilessly crush any obstacles hindering their success. When the enemy ships began to slowly gather on the horizon, Ramses gave the order for the archers to take advantageous positions on the shores, creating, along with thousands of spearmen and cavalry hidden in the reeds and secluded thickets, a powerful line of defense. The atmosphere within the Egyptian army became incredibly tense. All soldiers held their breath, awaiting the first sign of the enemy's approach, all hope and faith concentrated in well-learned commands and preparations for the unexpected battle. And finally, one sail appeared on the horizon after another, as if a sign of fate. After the first came the second, the third, and soon the entire enemy fleet of the Sea Peoples was within sight. The Egyptians undoubtedly heard the creaking of thousands of oars, the roar of drums, the shouts of helmsmen and soldiers, all merging in a powerful chorus of battle sounds, foretelling the inevitable fight. When the enemy ships came within firing distance, Ramses gave the command and the battle began. Stones hurled from the Egyptian vessels rained down on the enemy ships, whistles and roars spread throughout the theater of war. In panic, the attackers tried to land on the shore, but they were met by Egyptian spearmen, emerging from behind the trees and surrounding the ships with a wall of shields, as if shielding them from destruction. While the enemy was detained, the fleet continued sailing down the river, striving to break through to the most important escape routes, while Egyptian forces built defensive positions to ensure the country's safety. Those who crossed the borders of my land were doomed, their fate forever recorded in history. As for those who landed by the sea, flames blazed at the harbor entrances, engulfed in fury and determination, and on the shore stood a wall of metal erected for protection. Enemies were pulled, overturned, and thrown to the ground, their ships were destroyed, piled up from stern to bow, and all their valuable belongings were thrown into the water, as if wishing to engulf them forever. Thus, I turned the waters back so that they would not forget Egypt, so that everyone would remember where their true origin lies. And even if they utter my name in foreign lands, may fear rise before their eyes, a sign that I am always near and ready to protect. This plan of the pharaoh turned out to be surprisingly successful. For the first time, the Egyptians were able to stop these sea invaders and put an end to their destructive camp. Ain. Ramses' inscription on copper tablets concludes this victory on a high note: "Rejoice, O Egypt, I have freed you from grief and suffering that tormented the heart of my people. I have granted you peace and tranquility. Those whom I crushed in battle will never return, their names are forever etched in history." But despite the triumph, the land of the pharaohs found itself isolated in a region ravaged and destroyed by war. Almost all the civilizations that once surrounded Egypt, the Mycenaean Greeks, Hittites, Hurrians, and Babylonians, had perished or vanished from the face of the earth by the time of his victory. Peaceful existence gave way to chaos and destruction. Trade routes, which these civilizations seemed to vitally depend upon for obtaining bronze and other precious goods, were destroyed or blocked, leading to a sudden economic downturn in Egypt. By the end of this period, known in history as the collapse of the Late Bronze Age, Egypt had become what could only be called a shadow of the great state it once was. When enemies attacked again from various sides, Egypt was able to repel their attacks, but its treasury was depleted to the limit, and the possibility of fully restoring its former glory was no longer there. Thus, the country, once powerful and indomitable, found itself weakened, its glory faded. The victory over the sea invaders remained nevertheless the last bright testament to its former might. The first mass workers' strike in An. The story took place during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses II, in the 29th year of his rule. It is important to understand that this crisis was the result of serious problems within Egyptian society and the economy at that time. The pharaoh himself, having already established himself on the throne, faced difficulties that undermined his power and caused widespread discontent among the working people. Especially acute was the problem of supplying craftsmen who were engaged in building the royal tomb in the village of Deir el-Medina. These masters were not only highly skilled specialists but also formed an important part of the workforce necessary for carrying out grand projects. However, despite their professional skills and significance, they were not provided with the necessary food rations, which caused severe malnutrition. The prolonged shortage of food, oil, fish, vegetables, and clothing sparked a wave of discontent. People who had lost the ability to meet their basic needs ultimately decided to take to the streets with open demands. "We are hungry. We have no more clothes, oil, fish, and vegetables." These words sounded like a direct message to the authorities, as such a situation compelled even the quietest and most obedient workers to action. It was necessary to immediately convey what was happening to the pharaoh himself because, if such an important segment of the workforce was in a state of extreme hunger and despair, what could be said about the situation in other parts of the country, where social and economic conditions could have been even worse? The strike lasted approximately a week, and the situation began to grow dangerously tense. Moreover, one of the leaders of the protesters, sensing the hopelessness of the situation, even threatened to damage the royal monument, the symbol of power and the era. Such a threat would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, but in the crisis conditions where the pharaoh's trust and authority were shaken and power seemed weakened, the protesters dared to do so. In the end, Ramesses II was faced with a serious challenge and had to seek ways to resolve the crisis. Although his reign lasted for another 2 decades, a total of 31 years, this incident became a significant episode of his rule and a testament to the tensions within the Egyptian state. However, by the millennium year BC, that is, approximately the 11th century BC, the situation inside the palace began to change. In the Egyptian court, all women, including the pharaoh's wives, his mother, and other close female relatives, lived in a vast palace complex that also had its own land. This was convenient for the pharaoh, allowing him to keep his subjects and close ones under control. But such an arrangement also gave rise to intrigue, since there was a strict hierarchy among the queens within the palace, and everyone knew perfectly well that the right to the throne had to be won by heirs born from the chief wife. Women of lower status sometimes resorted to schemes to improve their position and possibly secure the throne for their sons. One of these women was Queen Taya, who was a secondary wife of Ramesses but very ambitious and cunning. Her son, Pentar, by status had no right to the throne, which called into question her influence and future prospects. Radically changing the situation, Taya decided on a bold step to organize a conspiracy known as the Harem Conspiracy. In a short time, she attracted other members of the royal family and high-ranking officials to this plan, which was mentioned in later documents and records. Among them was a high-ranking official who headed the royal chamber, who joined the conspirators and began to pass on their ideas to their mothers and brothers. These people were ready to rise against the pharaoh himself to change the balance of power. The situation reached a critical point when one of the women living in the palace wrote to her brother, commander of the Nubian troops, and managed to persuade his support for their scheme. A clever combination of betrayals, magical rites, and rituals, the conspirators even created wax figures of the bodyguards and cast spells on them, clearly showed that they had serious intentions. They dreamed of killing Ramesses Taro and proclaiming the son of Queen Tai, Pentaver, as the new pharaoh. It was planned to carry out the uprising during the annual festival called the Beautiful Festival of the Valley. It was held every year at the new moon of the second month of the harvest gathering, known as Shimu. On this day, when in the royal procession the pharaoh and his retinue paraded to the river, they carried statues of the 3 main gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, as well as gods of Thebes and others respectively. At this solemn moment, bright and magnificent, the pharaoh, accompanied by priests and courtiers, represented the supreme power and wealth of the state, making this ceremony one of the most significant and spectacular events of the year. It was precisely on such days, when everyone seemed immersed in celebration, that the conspirators hoped to carry out their bloody operation and overthrow the ruler in order to install a new protege, the son of Queen Tai, Pentaver, at the pinnacle of power. After completing his ceremonies and affairs, he would easily board the majestic royal boat and set off on a long journey to the famous Theban necropolis. His goal was to visit the magnificent temple where royal rituals and prayers created an atmosphere of sacred celebration. As testified by some writings belonging to the priest of Fiv, we move with praise, kissing the earth before the lords of the gods on their festivals, on the first day of shining, which was called Shimu, on the day of sailing. The valley was filled with an atmosphere of solemnity and joy. People brought gifts in the form of various treats, drinks, and flowers, and along the river gently floated boats carrying 3 statues, magnifying divine powers. While this multi-day and grand festival continued, groups of conspirators, holding their breath, secretly prepared their treacherous attack against the king himself. On the 15th day of the month of Shimu, when the pharaoh was resting in his luxurious residence located in the western tower of the ancient city of Medinet, a sudden group of assassins attacked him, armed with sharp knives. Their attack was swift and merciless, like a storm crushing everything in its path. Modern studies of the mummy of Ramesses II have established that his throat was cut down to the bone by a sharp weapon, damaging the trachea, esophagus, and major blood vessels of the neck. As a result, death came to him within seconds, as if in the blink of an eye. Interestingly, no wounds indicating resistance or defense were found on the pharaoh's body. Obviously, he was caught off guard. The studies also revealed that during the attack, his big toe had been amputated, which seems unusual. Such an injury is unlikely to have occurred in the course of a struggle or fight for life. During the embalming process for the mummy of Ramesses II, a toe prosthesis was made apparently so that he could take it with him to the afterlife. This indicates that the real big toe was never restored, which may have been perceived as confirmation of his death or even as a trophy. Ramesses II, who once saved Egypt from dangerous sea nomads, now lay dying, shrouded in a bloody gloom, in pools of his own blood. Moreover, he was betrayed by his own relatives, his own family. But despite everything, the conspirators' plans did not come to pass. After this bloody deed, his son, the heir to the throne, was able to take control of the situation, suppress the rebellion, and seize the throne. Soon, a whole series of criminals appeared before the court. 17 people involved in the conspiracy, as well as those who, knowing about its existence, remained silent or evaded giving testimony. As a result, 28 death sentences were handed down, and many of the conspirators were executed. As an emergency measure after the pharaoh's death, in the punishment for betrayal and treason, some members of the conspiracy were subjected to harsh renamings. The brother of one of them, commander of the Nubian troops in the south of the country, originally bore the name Hemwaset, which meant he who came from Thebes. After the execution, he was renamed Benimwaset, which translates as evil in Thebes. Another participant in the conspiracy, Marira, his name meant beloved of Ra, received the new name Misitsura, which translates as hating him. Although the order of succession was restored, Egypt's fate was no longer as prosperous as before. Following the death of Ramesses II, years of internal strife and conflicts ensued among his heirs. 3 of his sons became pharaohs at different times, each striving to glorify their father's memory and strengthen their own position on the throne. Inspired by the example of Ramesses I, they bore his name to emphasize their continuity. Thus, as many as 8 rulers in a row bore the name Ramesses in memory of the slain predecessor. However, most of them were failures, ruling only a few years, often due to weakness or inability to cope with internal and external challenges. Meanwhile, Egypt faced an increasingly severe threat. The country suffered from regular droughts, leading to famine, and the absence of a single center of power made the state vulnerable. At this time, during the reign of the 11th Ramesses, against the backdrop of annual floods, years of famine, civil conflicts, and corrupt decay among officials, a powerful new force began to strengthen. It filled the resulting void caused by the weakening of royal power and turned into a powerful counterbalance to internal instability, becoming a kind of reflection of the crisis of the entire country. In ancient times, supreme power in Egypt was concentrated in the hands of the high priests of Ammonius, serving in Thebes, where their power grew with each passing year. These priests not only achieved truly phenomenal results, in strengthening their positions, but also gained incredible wealth bordering on heroic. In the process of years of expanding their holdings, they took control of about 2/3 of all land ownership within the temple boundaries of Egypt, significantly strengthening their economic and political positions. Moreover, control over 90% of Egyptian ships, as well as a huge portion of the gold reserves, gave them the opportunity to exert significant influence on trade, movement, and the country's economic stability. They became the main prophets, highly valued interpreters of the will of the god Ammon, and their words often became absolute truth for the rulers. The priests' power strengthened so much that in recent centuries they began to pass their positions to their sons, thus turning their power into hereditary. This created conditions for the emergence of a peculiar feudal, royal power that effectively ruled the hot lands of Upper Egypt and served as an alternative center of power. Overall, the influence of the priestly class of Ammon on the political life of ancient Egypt was so great that there was neither a holder of earthly power nor a sovereign whose position was not under their control. Historical sources testify to this in detail, describing the power of this new hereditary role, turning the priesthood into the true rulers of the country. Imagine that you are the high priest of Ammon, and the treasury and granary bearing your seal are under the protection of your orders. You possess full authority over the management of its sacred houses, each of which is part of your responsibility. Soon the house of Hathor, the mistress of the city of Dendera, will pass into the hands of your son, the heir destined to inherit the commandments of the ancestors and take your place in the hierarchy of power. Following this, the high priests of Thebes begin to transform into the de facto power of Upper Egypt, going so far as to start erecting grand tombs for themselves, providing fouda, their eternal immortality. They even create their own armies to protect their interests and expand their influence. In such a situation, the pharaoh gradually loses his previous status in the eyes of the people. Roles and authority change. Perhaps it was such circumstances that served as the basis for the overthrow of Ramesses XI, the last great pharaoh of his era. After his death, the Egyptian New Kingdom, an era when state power gradually disintegrated, became a thing of the past. Less than 10 years passed before the country broke into separate warring parts, as the central authority disappeared. Despite victorious battles against sea enemies, the Egyptian troops could not restore their former power. Over the next 4 centuries, Egypt's influence continued to wane, and this decline seemed irreversible. It was during this period, approximately, that the famous text The Tale of Wenamun was created, which tells of an Egyptian diplomat who journeyed north to obtain cedar wood from Phoenicia, the city of Byblos. However, upon his return, he discovered that the pharaoh's power had already lost its strength and authority. New trials awaited him aboard the ship. Wenamun faced robbery and brutal arbitrariness and turned to the ruler of the city of Byblos for protection. He told his story as follows: "That morning I woke up and went to where the prince was. I informed him, I was robbed in your harbor. Now you are the ruler of this land. Go and find my money. In fact, it belongs to Ammonius, Ra, king of the gods and lord of the lands." In response, the king of Byblos said, "Are you serious? Are you joking? I have no understanding of this at all." The situation grew increasingly tense when the king of Byblos refused to comply with the demand to pay tribute for the cedar forest products insisted upon by the pharaoh. Historians' opinions about the truthfulness of this story differ. Some consider it authentic, others view it as artistic fiction. But regardless, it perfectly illustrates. By the 7th century BC, the situation in Egypt had significantly deteriorated. This was well known to all who were interested in the fate of the ancient land. The 21st dynasty, which ruled in the north of Dultanila for most of the 6th century BC, emerged as a result of the rival of Libyan conquerors, peoples inhabiting the northwest coast of Africa. These Libyan tribes, firmly established in the region, initially adopted traditional Egyptian names for their first pharaohs, wishing to show respect for Egyptian culture and strengthen their legitimacy. However, by the times of the subsequent 22nd and 23rd dynasties, they gradually began reverting to more ethnically Libyan names, thereby emphasizing their uniqueness and belonging to their own people. Alongside this, they began to wear Libyan feathered headgear, a tribute to their cultural identity and distinction from the Egyptians. Despite the external symbolism, the Libyan kings did not form a unified state. Numerous tribal connections persisted within their power, and disputes and conflicts often arose between them. These contradictions led to internal wars, as well as clashes with their own chiefs, lords, and military leaders, who sought to strengthen their positions. At the same time, in southern Egypt, in the region where the power of the high priests of Ammonius reigned, independent and strong state activity continued. In addition, in the lands of Nubia to the south, a new state was beginning to mature, the Kingdom of Kush, which became one of the 2 largest African kingdoms located south of Egypt. Kush was situated at the 4th cataract of the Nile, covering the territory of present-day Sudan. For many centuries, this Nubian state was under Egyptian control. Egyptian expeditions upriver often ended in defeats, which eliminated any signs of a strong competitor in East Africa. However, with the collapse of the new Kingdom of Egypt, the situation changed. The Libyan kings, previously engaged in struggles with each other in the north, found themselves distracted. At the same time, the Kushites were given the opportunity to consolidate and create their own independent statehood. Despite repeated attempts by Egypt to restore control over the lands of Nubia through military invasions, Kushite resistance was very tenacious. The Egyptians left numerous impressive fortresses in this region, one of which, known as Napata, even became the capital of Kush. But besides military activity, the Egyptians transmitted their religion to the Kushites, whose cult they deeply embraced. The upper strata of Kushite society adopted the Egyptian gods and forms of worship, and the royal dynasties called themselves, no matter what, sons of Amun. Over the next century, the traveler Herodotus, exploring the Nile, described this region in detail, which he called Ethiopia. He noted that it was just south of Lephantina where the tribes of Ethiopians began to settle, and about half the population of the island on the river consisted of them as well. Near the island lay a large lake, around which nomadic Ethiopians lived. These people were distinguished by deep veneration of only two gods, Amun and Osiris, and did not recognize other deities. They had a sacred place for divination dedicated to Amun, which spoke of an advanced religious culture. While Egypt had ceased building pyramids over 1,000 years earlier, the kings of Kush began constructing their own necropolises, reviving the classic Egyptian style of tombs. Thus, the kingdom of Kush in Nubia became even more Egyptian in spirit. Although the culture of Kush had its own peculiarities and differed from Egyptian cultural traditions, its wealth and power were based on control over Nubian gold mines, as well as on active trade with regions south of the Sahara. This contributed to the creation of a well-armed and powerful army capable of defending and expanding the borders of the state. And one of the rulers of Kush named Kashta took advantage of this powerful position to strengthen his rule and expand the influence of the state. While the rulers of Egypt on the left bank of the Nile were immersed in continuous internal strife and civil conflicts, each of their reigns was aimed at strengthening their influence and authority among the high priests of Fif, the most important religious and political figures of that time. In the course of this struggle, one of the Libyan lords became so ambitious that he appointed his daughter to the prestigious position of the wife of the god Amun in the magnificent temple of this city, which testified to his strategy of consolidating his own position through political and religious symbols. Once in power, his daughter began to take decisive steps to expand her influence and consolidate authority. She declared Upper Egypt part of her father's kingdom, the Kingdom of Kush, which meant uniting two territories under one rule. At this time, in the Nile Delta, where hostile and often warring states were located, the Libyan rulers, engaged in internal civil conflicts and power struggles, were unable to prevent this ambitious move. As a result, Upper Egypt came under the control of Nubian rulers, marking a significant turning point in the region's history. When the Kushite king named Kashta died, the governance was inherited by his son Pi, whose status and power soon exceeded all expectations, transforming into the true empire of the Kushites. Around 700 years before our era, King Pi intensified foreign policy aimed at strengthening his positions and expanding influence beyond native lands. Foremost, as the military leader of the Nubian army, he led his troops downstream along the Nile River and began conquering the fragmented and weak states of Lower Egypt. His strategy was pragmatic. He allowed local governors to retain their positions, provided they pledged loyalty and dedication to the new ruler. An outstanding victory is immortalized on a stele erected by Pi himself, which perpetuates events and is dedicated to the ancient Egyptian gods. In his address to them, he emphasized that his victories surpassed the achievements of his ancestors. Listen to what I have done, surpassing my predecessors. I am the king, the embodiment of God, born from the womb of the world, marked as the ruler feared even by those above me in rank and power. He continued, my father was wise, and my mother sensed even before my birth that I would be a ruler, beloved by the gods, the son of Ra, and devoted to Ammonius. His son, named Shabaka, continued his father's work, restoring Egypt's integrity and unity. For the next century, the country was ruled by Nubian pharaohs belonging to the 25th dynasty. During these years, these rulers, native to Nubia, showed great interest in Egyptian culture, adopting the Egyptian language, building and restoring temples, which contributed to strengthening cultural ties between the two peoples. They gave each other Egyptian names, worshipped Egyptian gods with mystical devotion, and enthusiastically participated in the construction of pyramids in Nubia, a development unusual for the region, as such massive structures had not been built there for many centuries. Although the size of the Nubian pyramids did not reach the grandeur of the Egyptian pyramids from the Old Kingdom period, the very program of their construction became an important milestone in the cultural and religious development of Nubia. However, this relatively brief wave of cultural and political flourishing did not last long. In the north, a powerful force arose, the Assyrian Empire, which forever overshadowed even the greatness of Egypt. As already noted in the 13th episode, Assyria emerged in the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia and by the 7th century BCE had achieved unprecedented power, proclaiming itself the most powerful state of its time. Its armies regularly numbered more than 100,000 soldiers and, under the rule of King Esarhaddon, who was obsessed with his paranoid attachment to power, They expanded their territory far beyond their original borders, advancing along the entire eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. In the future, they even hoped to reach the shores of the Nile River itself, which was considered an important strategic objective. Against this powerful enemy stood the Nubian pharaoh named Taharka, the fifth ruler of the 25th dynasty. He was a man who took pride in his origins, standing out not only because of his status but also because of his dark skin, which testified to his Nubian roots. He was destined to face an overwhelming force capable of changing the course of history in this region forever. He paid special attention to the creation of statues, carefully considering every detail. When commissioning works of art, he chose durable black granite, from which he carved images of gods and rulers and then polished them to a perfect shine. This work took a lot of time and required skill, as every movement of his hands was aimed at achieving perfection. As he himself mentioned in one of his inscriptions, he arrived in Egypt at a young age and was chosen for the royal throne after the death of his predecessor. He was brought from Nubia together with royal brothers, whom he brought with him to strengthen his power and demonstrate the strength of the state. Taharka singled me out among other heirs and showed me special affection, which made my fate more significant in the eyes of everyone around. I managed to earn the respect of all the nobles and gain their reverence through my deeds and wisdom. However, only when the royal hawk rose in the sky, a symbol of power and divine blessing, was I crowned in Memphis, the great center of ancient Egyptian culture and religion. It is important to note that Taharka believed in the benefits of physical exercise and long runs. He insisted that all his warriors participate in night marathons. The king himself rode out on horseback several hours before midnight to observe the training of his army in the desert. They left Memphis at 9 o'clock in the evening, crossing the dark sands, and by dawn reached a large lake located nearby, then returned to their residence by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This amazing endurance came in handy during military campaigns when they successfully attacked the fortifications of the Levites across the desert and captured new territories in Palestine. This continued throughout the reign of Taharka, and his successes continued without fail. Evidence of this was the huge amount of good harvests that the main flooding of the Nile brought thanks to abundant rains and elevated water levels. There were so many resources that he allocated significant amounts of gold to support the Temple of Ammonius and to restore destroyed spiritual centers, as proudly recounted in inscriptions on his monuments. His Majesty was a man for whom faith and piety were of great importance. He worshipped God with all his soul and spent entire days seeking ways to please him, resting peacefully at night to restore his strength. He restored ancient temples falling into oblivion, built new altars and storages, and brought offerings of pure gold, silver, and copper for worship services. His heart was full of satisfaction, for his actions justified his faith and convictions. Each of his mornings brought new blessings, each decision was a benefit for the country. In that era, when he ruled all the land, Egypt seemed immersed in tranquility, its waters covered almost the entire territory, and the inhabitants lived without worries and anxious cares. The country reached such scale and stability as it had not known since the fall of the last kingdom almost 400 years ago. This period resembled the beginning of a new era of prosperity and revival, giving hope for the future. But happiness was short-lived. In the year 1674 BC, after 17 years of Taharka's rule, troubling news appeared. A threat from the north loomed in the form of a powerful army. This army belonged to the Assyrian king Ashurhad, whose name inspired fear and respect. The Assyrians were renowned for their unsurpassed military power, and few enemies could repel them. It is quite likely that this very news sparked a wave of fear among the Egyptians, who feared an imminent attack. Nevertheless, thanks to the wisdom and decisiveness of Taharka, he somehow managed to withstand this formidable threat. According to the testimony of the later Greek historian Herodotus, there is an unusual legend about how the Assyrian army was defeated in Egypt. According to the legend, the enemies were caught in a trap set by animals, nocturnal pests. In one of the stories, it is said that upon entering Egypt, they were attacked by field mice that gnawed at their quivers, bows, and shield handles. As a result of these attacks, many soldiers lost all their weapons and ammunition, significantly weakening their forces. Returning the next day to their camp, the Assyrians abandoned the battlefield without a fight, leaving the enemy's advance undefeated. In memory of that glorious victory, which became an important milestone for ancient Egypt, a statue of the king holding a mouse in his hand, a symbol of this unique event, has been preserved in one of the temples. This archetypal sculpture reminded of the vigilance and relentless strength of the Egyptian warriors, manifested at the most unexpected moment. It is impossible to say with certainty how reliable this story is and which events actually took place. Perhaps it refers to a sudden outbreak of a dangerous and devastating plague that struck the Assyrian army, forcing the military unit to turn back and return home. Or maybe the story is based on a daring nighttime ambush organized by Taharka's troops, a people renowned for their speed and agility in moving through the darkness, as well as their ability to strike unexpectedly and disappear just as quickly, like a shadow. After their camp was defeated and they suffered a loss in battle, the Syrian army found itself under relentless pursuit by the Egyptian forces. Snitches, and only upon reaching the borders of her country, she was able to stop. However, in reality, we have no precise or convincing information about these events, which often explains the silence of Assyrian sources. Probably for this reason, they lack information about what should have been a painful and shameful defeat for them, which it apparently was. Nevertheless, 3 years later, King Ashurbanipal, striving to atone for the disgrace and restore the honor of his army, launched a new, much larger campaign. He gathered an even more numerous and prepared army and once again went to Egypt. This time no one could stand against him. The Assyrians quickly broke through into the Nile Delta, and Pharaoh Taharka was forced to retreat and leave Memphis, fleeing south. The Assyrian advance was so rapid and powerful that the pharaoh did not have time to evacuate his family or the royal treasury. Enemy troops managed to seize Memphis, one of the key cities lying in the center of the country, and when the Assyrian king began its siege, he did not hide his triumph, victorious honors and memories. On the walls of the captured city, he solemnly wrote that he had killed many of its inhabitants, said that he pierced it 5 times with the tip of his spear, and that he left the wounds from these battle injuries forever. Ultimately, Memphis, a great and proud city, fell. In half a day's fighting, using minefields, tunnels, and fierce storming, the Assyrians destroyed and ravaged the city. It was burned by fire, and its royal family, including the queen and heir to the throne, as well as all the sons and daughters, were annihilated. Taking the wealth, stockpiles of goods, horses, cattle, sheep, all of this was transported to Assyria to strengthen and enrich the imperial borders. The countless Cushites inhabiting Egypt were wiped out, and none of them remained alive to offer resistance. In the new state of affairs, the Assyrian king appointed new rulers, governors in Egypt, Guber, Notarial, Aeders and commissioners, imposing on them an annual tribute and taxes. A similar strategy and policy aimed at strengthening control and weakening resistance seemed successful to him. However, if King Isar hadn't believed that he could easily subdue Egypt and turn it into his province, he was mistaken. Much later, just a year afterward, and since this would mean approximately 12 months by modern standards, the king Taharka, nephew of the former, appeared again in the southern lands of Egypt, having once again gathered forces from the kingdom of Kush. His appearance marked the beginning of a new uprising, which immediately undermined all the achievements of Assyrian rule. Many governors and viceroys appointed by the Assyrian king betrayed their masters, and it seemed as if the entire conquest system would shake and collapse. In anger, King Esarhaddon hurried back to Egypt to suppress the rebellion and restore control. However, on the way his health deteriorated significantly, and in the end, he died in the city of Haran, not having reached the goals of his campaign. His son ascended the throne, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, a man who quickly realized that in order to retain power and complete the undertakings, active measures were needed. His first step was to form a new army and immediately send it to Egypt to suppress the rebellion and finish what his father had started. The Egyptian forces were demoralized and weak because previous defeats and devastation had exhausted their potential. Consequently, Ashurbanipal easily captured Memphis, one of the main cities in the country. After a fairly short time, in 1663 BC, he again found himself on Egyptian territory to quell new unrest. This time he moved along the eastern bank of the Nile River southwards and reached the so-called ancient capital of Thebes. Even then, and this was approximately 424 years BC, Egypt was essentially ruled by weak and unstable authorities. Taharqa, the last barbarian king, had already died, and his nephew Tantamani occupied a fragile throne. He took part in battles with the Assyrians but suffered a crushing defeat, and with it vanished the last hope of Egypt for the return of its former strength. As a result, the Assyrian army surrounded the defenseless and unbeatable city of Philai at that time, dooming the Egyptians to final defeat and subjugation. Shurbanipal immortalized his victory by engraving it on a carved cylinder, a marked symbolic memento of the conquest. This city, under his control, became no longer just foreign territory, but part of his dominions. He conquered it thanks to the support of his allies Ashur and Ishtar, whose assistance proved decisive in this military and political confrontation. Inspired by riches that seemed limitless, silver, gold, precious stones, as well as magnificent fabrics, striking in their quality of cloth, and outstanding horses, significant symbols of wealth and status, and men and women who witnessed the events, all these valuables became fully at his disposal. But the most precious find he obtained were two luxurious obelisks made of electrum, each weighing about 2,500 talents. He uprooted them from the temple gates, removed them from their original locations, and took them along with the spoils to Assyria. Thanks to this wealth, enriching his treasuries, he left Thebes, concluding his campaign. His actions against Egypt and the kingdom of Kush were symbolic in nature, marking the end of the era of Egyptian hegemony. Although Assyria's rule over Egypt lasted relatively shortly and collapsed after only 50 years, the dignity of the Egyptians was never fully restored. Over time, through the centuries, Egypt was conquered by the Persians, representatives of the Achaemenid dynasty, and later, in the 18th century BC, by the armies of Alexander the Great. When Alexander's empire fell apart, Egypt remained under the rule of one of his former genera, Ls. Ptolemy. In the following 9 centuries, when the rulers of Egypt became representatives of the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, they spoke Greek and rarely showed interest in studying the native Egyptian language, preferring their own culture and language. It was they who ruled during this time, as evidenced by the long existence of their dynasty. But when Roman expansion became increasingly active, encompassing North Africa and eventually Egypt, the situation began to change. The last independent ruler of Egypt from the Ptolemaic dynasty bore a name that translates from Greek as "glory of the Father." Her name was Cleopatra. It is unclear whether she was Egyptian by origin, since her mother remains unknown, but Plutarch records that Cleopatra herself made efforts to learn the Egyptian language. Her voice was pleasant and melodious, and thanks to her broad education, she could easily switch between languages as if she possessed the skill of a multi-stringed instrument. Mastering the languages of foreign peoples, she could communicate without an interpreter with Ethiopians, Jews, Arabs, Syrians, Parthians, and many others. She showed exceptional ability in learning languages, especially considering that many of her preceding rulers rarely had such a developed command of foreign languages. Probably, her ancestors previously did not attach particular importance to this or did not consider learning the Egyptian language necessary, since most of them regarded it as part of a long obsolete culture. When Roman rule finally came, and Egypt ended up in their hands, Cleopatra most likely committed suicide, possibly by taking poison or receiving a puncture from a poison needle. Some ancient authors recount a more romantic version of her death, that she used a poisonous snake. Regardless of how true this is, this legend became part of classical literature, inspiring poets and writers, including William Shakespeare. With her death, in August of the 30th year before our era, the last support of independent Egypt disappeared. At this moment, Cleopatra was at the height of her history, and her state, with its more than 3,000-year history, had almost reached its final chapter. The greatness of her country was largely embodied in the image of the famous pyramids in Giza, erected more than 2,000 years ago, a testament to its wealth and power. More than 500 years had passed since these ancient monuments were built, and this time difference makes Cleopatra's era much closer to our time than to the moment of the construction of the Great Pyramids, which were created back in the distant 3rd millennium BC. Over time, Egypt was increasingly influenced by foreign cultures and civilizations, which significantly affected the preservation of its rich ancient traditions and customs. The unique writing system, which had been one of the main symbols of its culture for centuries, gradually disappeared. In the following centuries, when Greek writing became widespread and increasingly popular, knowledge of hieroglyphic script gradually vanished from the face of the earth. This was detailed by a medieval Arab traveler who noted that the ancient inscriptions on pyramids, temples, and other monuments were no longer decipherable. When asked why this was happening, he replied, "Because the scholars and those who in ancient times used hieroglyphs have disappeared. And Egypt came under the rule of foreign peoples, foreigners and warriors, conquerors who increasingly forgot their ancient culture. As a result, the Greek alphabet prevailed, and the people of the country lost all understanding of the written signs of their ancestors." The last known hieroglyphic inscription was made in the year 494 AD in a temple located on the island of Philae, which was near the Nile in the Aswan area. At that time, the Roman Empire, having already embraced Christianity, acted against the worship of pagan gods and forbade rituals and ceremonies in Egypt. Aeon sanctuaries. Yet, despite this, the temple on the island remained outside the boundaries of Roman influence and continued to be used in ancient rites. Here, among stone walls, they kept pronouncing the names and blessings of the gods Are, Ta, Anubis, Hathor, as well as Amon and Batet, Set, and many other deities who had for centuries protected earthly life. Incense burned here, cats, considered sacred animals, were fed and cared for, and sacrifices were performed. However, with each passing year, this temple became increasingly isolated from the surrounding world, giving way to oblivion and disappearance. In one of the last hieroglyphic inscriptions preserved in the temple, a bitter and touching story was reflected. It depicted the image of a fox named Nesmetarikim, who wanted to leave a memory of his ancestors so that his inscription, his eternal message, would be preserved for descendants. This inscription was intended for Mangelus, son of the mountain, the high priest, who was obliged to preserve it forever through his written words. These words declared, "Nesmetarikim wishes his memory to remain alive through the ages, so that his descendants always remember their ancestors, their deeds and morals." It can be assumed that Nesmetarikim fulfilled his cherished dream. His inscription became the last known example of hieroglyphic writing in this region. However, only a few were able to understand or decipher it. The lost art of this complex writing system seemed to have left humanity forever, along with the disappearance of the religious and cultural traditions of the ancient Egyptians. With the departure of hieroglyphs, it seemed an entire era had vanished, connected with the wisdom and beliefs of ancient gods. In the 530s, when power was taken by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, the temple was finally closed. It was converted into a Christian church, the Church of St. Stephen, and the ancient pagan heritage gave way to the new faith. Thus, the era of ancient Egypt seemed to have come to its finale. Lu vanished into oblivion. Almost 400 and 1500 years later, in the 18th century, new events took place connected with this disappearing heritage. That year, the Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley participated in a friendly competition with his friend, the poet Horace Smith. In one of the newspapers then popular in London, they read about the upcoming arrival at the British Museum of an astonishing fragment of a statue brought from distant Egypt. This fragment represented the head and part of the torso of the great pharaoh, the hero of the Battle of Kadesh, Ramesses II. The statue was part of a pair that adorned the entrance to his temple, one of the greatest monuments of Egyptian art. European powers, eager to acquire this unique specimen, had long dreamed of possessing it. Napoleon Bonaparte was no exception. In 1798, while in Egypt, he attempted to remove this fragment but encountered serious difficulties due to its heavy soiling and damage. Despite all his efforts and desire to obtain this masterpiece, he failed, and the memory of the statue remained only in archives and drawings. This incident became one of many episodes in the long history of European interest in ancient Egypt and its rich culture. The statue, carved from diorite, proved too heavy for simple transportation. Nevertheless, a British team, armed with wooden rollers and hundreds of workers pulling ropes, managed to lower it from the height and carefully place it on the banks of the Nile River. There, with the help of special rafts and vessels, the statue was transported along the river directly to London. Upon learning about the existence of this unusual sculpture, John Smith and Charles Shelley wagered with each other. Each of them was to create a poem inspired by it and based on an excerpt from the works of the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who once visited the temple of Ramesses II in Thebes and left his notes. However, fate arranged so that Smith's creation remained virtually unnoticed. Oh, then how Shelley's poem turned into a classic work and became one of the most famous and greatest poetic forms of the English language. This poem, titled Ozymandias, symbolizes human vanity and the pride of rulers, represents the inevitability of the fall of tyrants, and also expresses the power of time and the fleeting nature of everything that seems eternal. On one of his travels, I met a traveler from an ancient land, who had his own special vision. He told of two enormous stone legs standing motionless in the desert, without bodies to which thousands of eyes converged. Nearby on the sand lay a broken face, a kind of photomask without eyes and nose, frozen in time. According to the traveler, the gloomy expression, wrinkles on the lips, and the cynical smirk of this face seemed to convey passions and emotions that still live within these soulless stone figures. He also noted that the hand mocking them and pointing in their direction, as well as the heart that once beat in their chest, are still imprinted in these statues, as if defying time. On the pedestal was inscribed the words, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, mighty and magnificent, and despair." Around this grand monument, ruined and abandoned, stretched a boundless desert, with smooth and lifelessly dry sands and silence encompassing everything around. On the wall of the tomb of an ancient pharaoh and nympha of the Middle Kingdom was a passage known as the Harper's Song. This text was engraved in Egyptian hieroglyphs and intended to be performed on the day of burial. It was a sacred work more than 4,200 years old. In creating his poem, Ozymandias drew inspiration precisely from this ancient text, which had entirely lost its original meaning for contemporaries. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the author of the poem, could not have known about the existence of this record, since hieroglyphs had not yet been deciphered. Despite the difference of 4,000 years, both Shelley and the author of the ancient song convey the same human feelings, awe, sorrow, and trembling before transient greatness, which have not changed since ancient times. Gazing upon the ruins of great palaces and tombs of bygone eras, one experiences a profound, trembling emotion. Listening to this song, one involuntarily reflects on the immeasurable chasm of time that separates our world from their epoch. You imagine how sad it is to see your language vanish, your cities crumble and turn to ruins, and your names erased from human memory. Remembering the tombs of ancient kings, now opened and plundered, and fallen columns of temples covered with sand and time, you feel the centuries passing by. The risen sun, a red and blazing disk, sinks below the horizon, marking the end of another day, symbolizing the completion of the cycle of life and rule. Each generation replaces another, leaving behind only memory and stone testimonies of their achievements and doubts. The people who lived in those distant times have long since disappeared among us, and their gods, resting in granite pyramids and monuments, have long vanished. Majestic and blessed personalities, rulers, nobles, and saints all are buried underground, their names and deeds have dissolved into the centuries. Thus continues the chain of history, reminding us of the fleeting nature of all things human and the impermanence of times that inexorably pass, leaving behind only stone, sand, and memory. Even those who once erected magnificent palaces, rich and astonishing with their architectural refinements, sooner or later left this earthly world. What fates befell them after their departure? Often, it seems to me that their voices still sound somewhere in the dark corners of the past, reminding us of those great times. But where are their abodes now? The walls of their palaces and gloomy castles have turned to ruins, erased by time and oblivion, as if they never existed. There were so many of them that it seems they vanished forever, they cannot return here. And to tell us about their CRI in the other state, how they feel on the other side, how their days pass, they have no way to tell us, for they have left forever, leaving us facing the unknown. Therefore, it is important to listen to the voice of your soul, to follow your inner calling. Living in harmony with yourself and striving for happiness, that is what truly matters. Do everything on this earth that your heart demands, that your intuition suggests, because in the end, your day of farewell to this world will definitely come. See off your days with joy, filling them with love and gratitude, not wasting time on negativity or sorrow. None of those who have departed ever take material things with them, because everything they valued goes away with them. And no one who has left this world can return back to see once more the simple, living, and unique course of life.